It happened in a suburban district of the empire. Behind that mountain, there was a little girl with blonde hair and a very charming face. She noticed a strange object in front of her. She couldn't help but be frightened. Then, acting on her meddlesome curiosity, she reached out and pinched the skull's cheek. Her eyes lit up in surprise. To her astonishment, it was not only springy but could speak. She pinched it a few more times. It grew slightly uncomfortable, took the girl's hand, and asked her to stop. Afterward, it admonished her at length not to play with strangers. Even specifically pointed out how strange it was that something like it could speak. However, the girl pretended not to care and recited her mother's advice that one should not judge others by their appearance. This left the skull bored and speechless. Then the girl, curious, asked for its name. It replied that it was a messenger entrusted with carrying the emperor's holy decree to the four corners of the realm. Hearing this, the girl was filled with admiration, which delighted the skull to the point of giddiness. It smugly reiterated that its work was extremely important. It even required mastery of advanced rites to be eligible for the position. The girl couldn't help but praise it enthusiastically. Then, eyes shining, she begged it to let her become its disciple. This made it smile so broadly that its eyes narrowed. It hadn't encountered anything this amusing in a long time. However, after a moment's thought, the skull sighed and complained that it would be troublesome, which only made her plead even more earnestly. Then she walked over and patted its shoulder. She coaxed with little hiccups, using every ounce of her cuteness. But no matter what she tried, she still did not succeed. And so, the next morning, the skull still lay leisurely beneath the old tree's canopy. Then the little blonde girl suddenly reappeared, playing around him and leaving him helpless. He saw that she seemed to want to learn techniques from him. The skull urged her to give up and cling to her mother's skirts, but she was stubborn and insisted on staying to play here. Her family situation was far from ordinary. Her loved ones had all perished in a fire. It left the young man speechless. He didn't dare say a thing, because it turned out that this was why the little girl played here by herself. When the blonde girl picked up her stick, seeing her standing tall, it reminded the skull of an old friend. Then he felt helpless. He reluctantly agreed to teach her swordsmanship as she wished. It also served to improve his reputation. The little girl shouted with joy. After hearing about the girl's tragic family background, the skull felt somewhat touched, and that's why he decided to teach her. And so, every day, they trained together. They slept together. They even summoned undead spirit masters together. But when they chased her, the skull would sit back and relax. After a while, the girl would turn back and chase them instead. Even teaching her how to scare others was something the skull calmly taught her. Then together they would go and frighten passing adventurers, causing him to lose consciousness on the spot. And so the days passed. The skull felt that the bond between the two had grown much stronger. He was no longer embarrassed whenever the little girl leaned against him to sleep. Gradually her swordsmanship also improved. The techniques that Skull had once taught were all absorbed by the girl. She learned very quickly. Before long she had closed in on him, putting him on the defensive. As time passed, the girl's beauty also gradually improved. It made Skull feel that the path they'd walked together was worthwhile, inside and out. And then 11 years later, Skull, as always, went hunting to find food for both of them, while the girl was bathing by a cool stream. After 11 years, her figure had become fuller and much cuter than before. A little while later, the two of them were cooking on a patch of bare earth. Then the girl put on a serious expression and spoke to him. This made him fumble along as well. Then she said that the village she had once lived in had recently disappeared, because the number of monsters had grown too great. The villagers had all abandoned it. They said the empire had abandoned the border villages, which led to this state of affairs. At that point her voice grew somber. Skull immediately realized what she intended. He resigned himself to letting her pursue her desire. He even encouraged her by telling stories about an old friend because he believed that saving people requires no credentials. Then Skull took out a short sword and swore on his honor. Benlira, the sole heir of the Northern Hunting School, as your master, present this to my beloved disciple, with the hope that you will draw the blade only for benevolent intentions. Go save the world and then come back. I will wait for you right here. And so time passed in the blink of an eye. The girl had finally grown up enough to leave him. He watched her silhouette gradually fade into the mist. It filled him with a touch of regret. But he stood still. He believed that, no matter how long it took, the child would surely save the world and return. All he had to do was wait. And so, sometime later, the skull was still in the same place, waiting for the girl to come back to him. Then she appeared and sat down beside him, her body covered in wounds. This took him by surprise. The girl forced a bright smile to greet him, while her left lower leg was gone. Just as he was about to ask, she suddenly burst into laughter, dispelling the awkward atmosphere. Then she chattered on about her journey. However, as she told her story, her breathing gradually grew weaker. Seeing this, the skull ran over and held her in his arms. He couldn't help but feel worried deep inside. At that, the girl trembled, hugged him tightly, and asked after him, with a hint of teasing in her tone. In an instant, the girl's heart stopped. This caused the skull to miss a beat. He hadn't been able to cry for a long time, yet now he shed tears over this human girl. Meanwhile, elsewhere, a cavalry unit formed a long line. It turned out they were searching for the girl. But after they had gone some distance, the leader noticed a faint figure deep in the forest. At that moment the skull loosened the sealing cord of the sword, with an utterly desperate expression. When the sword was opened, to everyone's surprise a monster was dwelling inside. In an instant, the monsters poured out. They swarmed after their targets and tore them apart savagely. It turned out the skull wasn't as Na'vi as we had thought. He was a true demon. Wherever he went, he disemboweled the legions of the undead. Bodies piled into heaps and vegetation sprang up to conceal the grim stains he had left behind. Because he feared the dark mages would exploit him, he had always stayed to guard this place. But now, he no longer needed to. The leader saw his comrades being savagely torn apart. He couldn't help but worry and ordered everyone to form up. After all, that man was utterly confident in his own strength. But when he looked at the fiends before him, the earlier complacency had now become pure fear, because the number of undead forces was too great to count, making the leader question his identity. Where is this? Who am I? Just as he was stammering, a streak of light flashed past. The leader was beheaded by the knight on his warhorse. When it was all over, the skull pointed the tip of his sword downward, mustering all his strength, and then drove it straight into the ground, causing the surrounding earth and rock to split wide open. And from there, the sky gradually turned red as well. Thunder and lightning went berserk. The skull, as the emperor's mouthpiece and the voice of the empire, ordered the demon host that, if the empire strayed from the founder's will, then he would permit the nobles and loyal ministers. He rose up to put the empire back in order. From that heap of corpses piled up for more than 100 years, he stood up and burned the banner of the one who had commanded his disciples. "O my homeland, pay for your tyranny." At that moment, a cavalryman threw himself forward with all his strength. He panicked and ran toward the burning empire, visibly terrified. However, before he could call for help from his comrades, he was logged out by that massive army of monsters. Both sides fought fiercely, but it seemed the advantage was tipping toward the monsters, because they even knew how to make explosives, causing the whole group to be blown to pieces in an instant. They even had flying mounts, quite unlike the king's cavalry. In the hazy mist, then another attack erupted from the army's side. Meanwhile, on the human side there was another hero, Donru, who possessed extraordinary power. With just a single flick of his hand, he could split monsters in two. He even had a short blade technique that produced 5 slashes toward his opponent. He only needed to breathe out, and he could scatter the envoy's cavalry in the blink of an eye. He was famed as the empire's official knight. At that moment, a roar echoed. It came from the giant monster on the other side, furiously rampaging. Then Donru bored, shrugged and carried on. He looked across at the opposite side, and saw a skull-conjuring sorcerer perched on its arm. Yet Donru felt no fear at all. Instead, he quickly drew his sword, with merely a light tap on his blade. Suddenly all the giant demonic beasts had both legs cut off. Even the skull's left leg was grazed by him before he knew it. It turned out this technique was called Lak Dai Van, a move with massive destructive power and incredible speed. It caused the demonic creatures to reel. They toppled to the ground. Even the skull couldn't believe his eyes. He remembered the scene of his disciple losing a leg in exactly the same way. Suddenly, an indescribable feeling arose within him. Then he flew toward Donryu. Seeing this, Donryu quickly drew his sword. With a thunderous clash, their collision sent dust and debris flying everywhere. Donryu managed to parry the skull's deadly strike. However, he was still significantly overwhelmed. So Donryu resorted to a move to deflect the skull's sword. This caused him to waver. Then he forced the skull's blade down into the ground. After that, he quickly reversed his sword with quick thinking. He swung it in a line toward him. However, the skull promptly ducked and kicked at his shin, causing him to buckle forward. Then the skull launched a punch straight at Donryu's face. He struggled and lunged forward, climbing onto his body, and pounded him repeatedly. Before a finishing stab could be delivered, Donryu used his suppleness. He raised his leg and pressed the skull's head close to his own, which left him momentarily stunned. Then the skull had no choice but to step back, waiting for another opportunity. At that moment Donryu wiped the streak of blood from his mouth. He even thought it had been a long time since he'd fought someone this strong, and he was curious about the identity of his opponent. But the skull merely replied indifferently, "A vengeful one." Then Donryu came up with a plan to provoke his opponent, by prodding at his loved one, causing him to fly into a rage. He believed that summoning drained a great deal of energy, so he had to prolong things in such a despicable way. Suddenly a hand lunged in, and grabbed his face tightly, followed by a sword thrust straight into the hand that held Donryu's sword, preventing him from moving at all. he screamed in pain. Suddenly the skull's tears fell again. He couldn't understand why it was over matters of power, to the point of killing his own creation. The more he taunted, the more he prodded inside his mouth, making him bleed. He couldn't take it anymore. He could only suppress the pain and, struggling, swung his sword. But before he could do anything, the skull rammed him in the stomach. He was hurled against a rock. Donryu showed no remorse. On the contrary, he took pleasure in provoking him even more, which made the skull even more enraged. But before his death drew near, there were streaks of blue light shining up into the sky, making the skull puzzled. The beams reacted more and more strongly, and spread across the entire neighborhood. It turned out it had all been part of their plan, stalling to buy time to form a barrier against the undead. Emboldened, Donryu threw back his head and laughed. Immediately from the mountain's mouth, a great surge of magical power was unleashed, forming a plus-shaped pattern. Along with it, objects from all around were hurled upward. This magical power quickly spread everywhere, causing the demonic creatures, in a matter of moments, to rot away completely. The cavalry, who had been fighting fiercely, had to stop and burst into joyful shouts. At that moment, on Donryu's side, he smugly assumed that this barrier had been created by the mages of the heroes group from 120 years ago. No matter how strong it was, the skull still could not stop itself from dissolving. The barrier reminded him of an old friend with an oddly perfectionist personality. After hearing Donryu's story, the skull still showed no fear. He believed that the citizens who had been exploited would return with him to take revenge, bringing the apocalypse to the empire. The tale of heroes who despised war, that both protected and claimed countless human lives. And then, when peace arrived, he thought everything was over. However, not long after, the long-standing crack began to split open again. For everything they had done had been in vain. When peace came, they grew even more greedy, killing all the heroes to conceal the king's secret monopoly, leaving him still unable to understand with what mindset he had once stepped onto the battlefield, and for whose sake he had done so. In an era where heroes had died because of the war, then where should he go? He had no clear path. And so, about 4 days after that hero extermination incident, he wandered about, lost and drifting everywhere. He met many different faces. At that moment, one of them, seeing the skull ask for directions, couldn't help but be suspicious. However, to avoid standing out, the skull had to plead. After asking, he would leave. But they did not want that. They wanted to start trouble, because the man had detected a strong smell of blood on him. Then the man began to spread a rumor that had been going around recently. In the Green Tower village on the other side of the mountain range, an undead sorcerer had slain the knights and ravaged the village. He suspected the skull. In an instant, he threw his dagger toward the skull, without the slightest hesitation, because when looking at his fully covered, hooded appearance, he realized this was exactly an undead. This drove the skull into a rage. The skull snatched the dagger back. Then he drove it hard into the wooden floor where he stood, causing the man to be taken by surprise. For he had not expected that the skull would have discovered a man he had arranged to hide under the floor. So the man had no choice but to reveal his true face, and he ordered his subordinates to charge, demanding they tear the skull's bones into 100 pieces. Noticing that the opponent deliberately ignored his plea made him somewhat irritated. And when the burly man leapt forward, aiming to chop him up for the dogs to eat, the skull quickly bent down, and in just a few seconds, he landed more than 100 blows on the burly man's body. And when the final strike was delivered, he reserved it for the burly man's eye, leaving him with no choice but to bury his face in the ground. Next came the man wielding the spear. He had arranged a formation so that any thrust would surely hit. However, when applied to the skull, it was all for nothing. In the blink of an eye, the skull nimbly closed in, grabbed his collar, then threw him flat onto the floor. He fainted instantly. Not stopping there, he even had another ace up his sleeve. He planned to use the two cooperating twins. They quickly closed in on the skull and moved in a circle, distracting him. As soon as they seized the opportunity, they drew their knives and stabbed straight at the skull. However, the skull jumped up in time and caught their hand, leaving them bewildered. Immediately, the skull dropped down and smashed their heads to the floor with his hands, then quickly ran off. This made the man who had been standing jump up to look. To his surprise, the skull had appeared from behind, sat on the edge of the table, causing the man to recoil in shock, and simultaneously used his sword to perform a magical technique, slashing wildly at the skull. However, the skull wouldn't take it lying down and used his hand to deflect the man's attack. Then the man took a deep breath and slowly sensed the opponent's movements, so that, if the opponent kept coming the same way, he could deliver a finishing slash to end the skull. But the skull was quicker. He anticipated it, grabbed his opponent's hand and leapt up. At the same time, he swung his leg to the right to kick the man's ugly face, sending him sprawling to the floor. Everyone nearby who saw it couldn't help but be astonished. Because of that, the skull struck the man in the blink of an eye. From the midst of a hazy cloud of dust, The skull muttered in annoyance as it chose the next name, planning to give him a thrashing to teach him not to be so insolent. However, before it could execute the next one, someone stepped forward to intervene. This allowed the panicked crowd to breathe a sigh of relief. It turned out that this person was the head of the guild, Thor, the head of the Northern Exploration Guild of the Garium Empire. Cut to the office. He spoke about the rumors that had been circulating. Thor said he had sent many teams to search, but all had been in vain. He had assumed it was all just a rumor, but when he looked at the skull, he had his answer. It was all true. The skull angrily slammed the table. It demanded that he beg for mercy before the skull grew furious. Then Thor took out a pouch of tobacco and spoke. The guild belonged to the Empire, but this place had long been abandoned. Villagers had left their homes to survive. Those who remained and took on dangerous missions to protect their homeland were slowly dying off. They were left waiting for the day when monsters would come and devour them. Upon hearing this, the skull couldn't help but wonder why they hadn't risen up against the Empire. If they had, things like this wouldn't have happened. Then Thor took a drag of his tobacco. He had tried every possible means, but in the end all had failed, because other places were just like his guild. They were pouring all their resources into protecting their homelands, no different from here. The skull, hearing this, wondered why they didn't band together to oppose the Empire. Then Thor thought it would lead to war. It wasn't enough to succeed by courage alone, because more people would die. They had always lived harshly, hoping that some hero would come to save them. And then that hero appeared. She carried both pride and kindness, and that warm hope revived the despairing like them, who embraced a truly delusional dream, only for things to gradually get worse because that hero had died. He no longer had the dream of restoring his guild and his village. Now there was only regret, neither truly alive nor dead. So he begged the skull for a mission, to send 2 additional explorers and to gather every possible force to assist, regardless of whether the one he appealed to was a spirit or a demon, as long as they could contribute some of their own strength to destroy the Empire's guild that had abandoned them. After hearing his plea, however, having heard the story about his disciple, the skull could never be that heartless. He reached into his trouser pocket and took out a command tablet, then tossed it to Thor. He then realized this was an explorer identification card that had been revoked, the highest rank among the cards, which made him inevitably curious about the skull's identity. But the skull shrugged it off and walked away, saying, "Don't worry about me, I'm just a ghost of an ugly past." The skull agreed to take the mission, but first he had to go to one place. That was the Northern Mountain Range, famed as the continent's largest and most dreadful range. And so the skull's journey with his new companions officially began here. The scene shifts to the Northern Mountain Range. They had been traveling for 5 days since they set out. They moved very carefully, avoiding encounters with the Empire whenever possible. Even the skull was astonished at how quickly they had been sneaking along the route. At that moment the skull used a spyglass to peer down. They couldn't stop wondering what ranks or titles those men below held. Ponytail then explained that they were survivors from the Blue Tower village who had come here to raid another village before returning to the capital. Because they were being delayed by the cold here and couldn't return, they had been stealing from the villagers. When she saw the skull address her with rude words, she introduced herself as Mira. She also mentioned that the red head's name was Harrier and told him to remember their names. Mura went on to say that if one follows the lower path, they would find a few small houses. Imperial knights often plunder villagers in order to survive. Since the current emperor ascended the throne, this has been considered normal. Hearing this, the skull couldn't help but grow furious and wanted to kill them all. The murderous intent emanating from the skull made Harrier shudder slightly. Harrier, taken aback, asked him what he was looking for. Then, in the blink of an eye, the skull vanished from in front of them. He jumped down from that dizzying height below. At that moment, the group of knights couldn't help but be stunned. They looked toward the skeleton that was moving in front of them. At the same time, from above, Harrier couldn't help but worry that the skull might be killed. But the girl Mira beside him only sighed and said he had been dead for a long time. And in the blink of an eye, the skull eliminated the first knight. He then glanced at the several others swarming him. Then he bent down. He used a technique that blurred his opponent's vision. He then mercilessly slashed each of them. He reduced them to pieces of flesh that fell to the ground. One female knight saw this and tried to reassure the others. However, she caught the skull's eye. He teleported behind her and ripped her head off. Her head was even stuck on his blade. He then mocked her, saying she had no eyes to see, because she had dared to claim the skull was alone and that there was nothing to fear. Then the skull summoned his undead army to annihilate them all. Even Mira and Harrier above couldn't help but be impressed. At that moment, all the spectral creatures surged forward, aiming to tear each of those so-called knights to pieces. Meanwhile, the skull quickly rode up on his horse. He gripped his sword tightly in his hand. Then Then he slashed each one into thin strips of flesh. He even used one of his subordinates as a human shield to avenge his disciple after that challenge. People came to call him the ghost of the Blue Tower village. After realizing the situation was drawing to a close, Mura and Harrier decided to go down as well. So the skull had to rest for a moment. He stood still, watching the blood-soaked scene around him. He thought the situation was gradually tipping in his favor, because his army of monstrous beasts was stronger than theirs. At that moment, a fearless knight appeared. He rushed forward to launch a surprise attack at the skull, but the skull managed to dodge the blow. He sacrificed his mount as a decoy. Then he leapt up and kicked hard at his head. Suddenly a gold necklace came into view. It was hanging on the knight's person. It reminded him of an earlier encounter, when the man had offered a handmade necklace. The man had said it was an apology, pleading for the skull's forgiveness. He awkwardly scratched his head, explaining that earlier, not understanding the situation, he'd rushed in and attacked. Reluctantly, the skull accepted the necklace. He even cheerfully thanked the man for giving him the good luck charm. Then the man revealed it had been made by his daughter, who had been killed by Imperial soldiers 2 years earlier. He went on to tell stories about the others from before. They were hardly any different from him. Each person nursed their own wounds and cursed the Empire. He urged the skull not to sink too deep into vengeance, lest he become like them. He believed that everyone had someone waiting for them, and he was sure the skull did too. Back in the present, he slowly realized the truth. The person standing before him was the one who had sneaked a punch at him earlier. But before he could bring himself to forgive her, he was stabbed in the back by another fiend wielding a spear. The wound caused his body to grow progressively rigid. Suddenly she burst into tears and began apologizing. She apologized to her father for having been away for 2 years and for not being able to return. Then he collapsed onto the cold ground. The skull remained silent. He then killed his subordinate, because he had dared to act without his permission. And that was also when the 2 explorers had just arrived below. Mura asked him to rest for the time being and let the 2 of them take care of the remaining cleanup. And then, in just a few hours, they had finally gathered all the bodies and burned them. Harrier was puzzled. He hadn't expected the skull to destroy all the bodies instead of using them for a summoning. The skull stood motionless before the flames. He did not take his eyes off them. This made Harrier feel a measure of sympathy for the skull's loneliness. In the skull's chaotic mind at that moment, there were voices criticizing him for daring to open himself to humans once more. They incessantly whispered negative things into his head. However, he would not be easily shaken by that demon and retorted, "If you re dead, then lie quietly in the underworld," which made it burst into laughter. And it continued to mock his feelings. It accused him of being overly sentimental, of still having feelings for humans. Then retreated into the cursed sword. It taunted the skull, "Try to run from your fate." At the same time, elsewhere, the entire capital was engulfed in flames. There was one person who stood and watched, indulging his perverse satisfaction. She even thought the smell of burning human flesh was pleasant. At that moment, one of her subordinates stepped up to her, suggesting they use the princess's head for a spectacular game of football, even asking her to join in. However, she declined out of boredom. She had thought this kingdom was mighty, yet it had fallen so miserably to her. She wondered whether she would ever meet an opponent truly her equal. At that moment, a messenger from the Empire rode up to deliver news, ordering the elimination of the sorcerer commanding the undead army. Upon hearing this, she couldn't help but laugh loudly with excitement, for at last she would be able to test herself against another madman besides herself. Then she gave the order to assemble the army. Immediately the men clad in majestic armor stood ready. They lined up in formation, marching at her command. A bona fide bloodthirsty demon. Cut to another scene. After traveling a long distance, Mura had begun to grow bored. Because of the skull ever since that day, it hadn't once turned to speak to them. The more she stared at the skull, the more curious she became about how his head could float in midair. At an earlier time, Thor had spoken with the 2 explorers. He suspected that the skull was surely connected to that blonde-haired hero, because the moment the hero was chased by the knight and fled to the Blue Tower village coincided with the outbreak of the undead army. And when he looked at images of him in combat, it reminded him of that hero's silhouette in battle. Thor thought the skull didn't seem to be a bad person, but that didn't mean he would become their ally. However, if they followed the skull, it would almost certainly be the key to overthrowing the Empire. So Thor urgently begged the 2 of them to guide the skull. But Harrier was still hesitant about whether the skull would move according to their plans. Thor reassured them. He smiled at them because he trusted his own instincts. However, Harrier remained concerned about the matter, because when he looked at the skull, he had on his own decided to drop by Green Tower Village for a bit, because that place was full of memories. Memories belonging to him and his disciple. Back when the village was still alive with the bustle of its people, the little girl put a paper hat on the skull's head and took him out drinking so he could find out what beer tastes like. Then she ordered 2 drinks, one for herself and one for her master. After that, she even took the skull to play darts. And as expected, all 4 darts hit the 4 targets, causing everyone in the tavern to cry out in surprise. This green tower village was filled with the laughter of its people, and for the skull, who had long been cut off from human contact, he now felt happy that he had chosen this place as a refuge. However, after that purge of the heroes, the entire population here had migrated elsewhere. Some had even lost their lives because of the needless conflicts between those brutal imperial forces. Now the skull sat back in his old seat, the tavern where he had once enjoyed himself with his disciple. Then suddenly a glass of beer was set down. This left the skull bewildered, not understanding what was happening. It turned out to be the same waitress from before. The skull, who had been in a numb state, suddenly came to. He wondered why, when she saw his true form, she felt no fear. Then the waitress said it was because of familiarity. After taking a sip of the wine, she went on chattering about the name and the meaning of the bottle. Then she said this was the bottle the disciple had asked her to keep when she left. The girl said she would save it for a journey they would one day take together, to enjoy it. People say that before beginning a journey, raising a cup together is a way to wish the explorers a safe trip, but these wines have long since stopped being sold. There are no more adventurers in the village. The waitress had come to think that what the skull was doing now was wrong. It could, however, save the people of the empire. But is this the image that girl had wanted? It made the skull pause and ponder for a moment. Then suddenly the waitress slammed a book down on the table. She said that if it were that child, she would want to see a much brighter image. Looking at the book placed on the table, he suddenly remembered the image of his disciple. This book was precisely what his disciple had left for him. A fairy tale-like story about defeating evil. Long ago the Ruby Explorers, they had embarked on an adventure. One day, the girl dreamed she would experience such an adventure with him. It caused him to pause for a moment. Then he reached for the beer glass that had been poured at the other end. He couldn't help thinking about his disciple, even though he was her teacher. But in fact he was the one who had learned the most. Then the skull stood up and left. It made the waitress laugh. This was because, at last, the skull had decided which direction to take. He had once dreamed the same dream as his disciple, an adventure the two would share. After stepping out the door, Mura fidgeted, wanting to tease the skull. However, the skull's next move left Mura stunned. It was the first time the skull had dared to talk back to her. Even Harrier noticed something different about him. He remembered what Thor had once told them. He couldn't help but admire Thor's foresight. And so, after that conversation with the waitress, the skull felt somewhat relieved. As a side note, explorers' ranks are divided into 10 tiers. They are classified by achievement, from Earth to Diamond. For safety, an explorer must not accept tasks beyond their level, and of course hiring high-level explorers is outrageously expensive. And ordinary people never exceed level 7. Those who do are called superhumans. From level 8 upward, they go out alone to explore uncharted region, or a battle-hungry fighter, holding back waves of monsters on the front lines, or perhaps imperial generals commanding armies. At that moment, a slash was struck. In an instant, the goblin's head was severed from its neck. After killing it, Harrier casually walked away. He looked at the streak of blood still on his sword. Then he looked up at the giant one-eyed monster staring at him. Mura appeared behind it just in time. She brought her blade down in one clean, sharp stroke. Basically, people who hunt things like this are considered mid-level adventurers. Then Harrier looked to the other side, the direction the skull had gone off on its own. It had split dozens of high-ranking monsters in two. After painstakingly explaining the ranking system, Harrier was a bit annoyed, thinking they had ignored him. Then the skull, curious, asked the two their ranks, and they told him both were rank 5. He thought this ranking system was somewhat different from when he had been an adventurer. Back then he had been level 7, a fairly famous female warrior. This made Harrier reflect on the bits of information from the past. But Mura burst out laughing, surprised that the person with an army of the undead who behaved like a man was actually a woman. Suddenly the skull's sword began to glow. Huge shadows suddenly appeared from behind them. It turned out to be the hulking bodies of high-ranking monsters summoned by the skull. Terrified, Harrier ran over and clung to the skull, so he had to stop the summoning this time to calm Harrier down. This was the first time he had laughed since his disciple died. It was because of the feeling of fighting shoulder to shoulder like this. Suddenly, the skull remembered images of his disciple, the times they had spent together, their happy training sessions and lessons. Back in the present, Mura still did not understand why the skull wanted to go to the northern mountain range. The skull then said he had an appointment with a few people and was looking for something. Because at first he had planned to charge into the undead legion formed by the Demon King's remnants 120 years ago. But Don't used a barrier that made his army vanish completely. That was not an ordinary shield. It was a protective barrier created by the mages of the old band of heroes to stop the waves of the undead. Because of that, the undead army became useless, so only a human army could overthrow the empire. At this point the skull could no longer hide it, and told them plainly that he would befriend the northern tribe and make them allies. This made Harrier go green with shock. They were completely insane. The skull's original aim had been to take the emperor's head and use it as a football. But his disciple had stopped him from doing that. Mura thought to himself that it would be far better to change the objective to rebuilding the empire. Sensing the situation was getting tense, the skull changed the subject. He teased them. Are you the ones who lost the great hunt and ran away? If not, why would northerners your age be here? Then the skull offered to show them a little of his skill. However, Harrier did not want to witness this, because he thought the skull would certainly thrash them, because after this round, the skull would summon high-tier undead to train with them a bit. Seeing that, Harrier frowned and told Mura to step forward and stop it. But when he looked back, he saw that she had run off before he even noticed. At that moment, the skull began counting down 10 seconds. When the time was right, he immediately directed the high-tier undead to chase after them. While he was delighted, Harrier was not. He looked toward the distant horizon. He couldn't help but smile because his path was being repeated once more. He stood up laughing, convinced that these two would become his unexpected disciples. Senior like him would directly turn them into the most powerful weapons in history. He was certain that this time he would not lose his way. So disciples up there in the sky watch him for the moments to come. Don't let loneliness consume you. Meanwhile, over there in the distance, Free was enjoying watching the undead scene unfolding before him. The high-tier monster was still chasing after them. It delivered a massive blow right where Harrier was, making him turn pale, begging the skull to spare him. A thunderous explosion occurred. Then, while he was fleeing for his life, he saw the woman's figure running back toward him. She put on a look of amusement and burst out laughing, frantically lunging forward to slash at the skull's undead, and aimed at the person controlling that undead, in utter excitement. When she could finally confront someone believed to be as strong as herself, while the skull was still bewildered, not understanding what was happening, the two swords collided with a jarring screech. Seeing that her opponent remained completely calm, Frey then used a spinning technique to force the skull, who was atop the high-ranking creature, to lie flat on the ground. At the same time, on Mura's side, the guards also appeared to challenge them. Meanwhile, the skull quickly stood back up. He then asked the identity of the person facing him. Frey, hearing that, courteously greeted him and introduced herself. One of the Empire's 4 knights Frey wore had come to engage the skull in combat. Hearing this, the skull remembered what Doan had told him about the arrival of the 4 knights. After the polite greetings were over, she then charged straight at the skull. Neither of them would yield. Frey was savoring the thrill of combat. She swung a horizontal slash down at the skull's legs, but he jumped up in time. He then tried to hook at her leg, but Frey managed to spin away in time. She then brought her sword down in a vertical strike toward the skull. After evading Frey's move, the skull then punched her repeatedly, but she dodged them all. She even kicked the skull flying, forcing him to retreat temporarily, and then analyzed her tricky attack patterns before Frey launched her next attack. Then the skull quickly hit a shard of stone. It then hurled it toward her eye. This temporarily blinded her, and she lunged in, punching wildly. However, unlike a normal person's pained reaction, the more she struck, the more excited she became. Then a slashing blow was delivered that sent the skull flying. This caused him to be slammed into the slab of rock ahead. She wore a cold, bored expression. She hadn't expected the one she was counting on to let her down. She figured the group of adventurers had obstructed his view. She even considered having them killed in front of the skull. After regaining his composure, the skull had to admit that Frey was very strong, but he realized one thing, that Frey's eyesight was actually very poor, which even surprised her, because of the direction the skull took. Because at some point the skull had cast a spell, using the undead to surround and obscure her vision. At the same time, she called for her disciples to flee. He then created a dense smoke to distract the enemy. Incidentally, he also summoned another undead creature. An undead snake was summoned to help them escape. Because of the earlier chilly smoke, Harrier couldn't react in time and began coughing and choking, tears streaming down his face. At that moment, Mura seriously discussed a plan to deal with Frey. The skull casually declared that running was the best option. Since they had crossed the boundary, fleeing now was the best course of action. He even ordered the undead snake to run wild to divert their path. However, the skull hadn't anticipated that they would climb onto the back of that long snake and chase after them. At that moment, Free leaped up and, together with his companions below, surrounded the skull. This forced him to reluctantly draw his sword again, to confront the real monster before him. Immediately, 2 sword strikes were unleashed, ripping through the very air. And of course the advantage favored Frey, utterly overwhelming. causing the undead snake to lose its head. After the fight, smoke and dust filled the air. She crawled out of the ashes. She giggled, having thoroughly enjoyed playing with the skull. At that moment, he only lightly wiped the tip of his nose, and scolded her as a scoundrel for daring to soil his cute outfit. When the skull called himself a lady, Free burst out laughing. The skull went home, checked himself in the mirror, and then spoke to her. Then the two began to trade barbs, and suddenly Frey grew a little bored. He ordered the skull to summon the Undying Legion for him to see. She figured it was surely the two men accompanying him who had disrupted her fun. So she planned to kill those two to rile the skull up and flaunt her strength. The more she spoke, the closer she got to the skull, prompting him to warn that a brat like her shouldn't come so close, which made her snort with laughter, and then felt the urge to crush the indifferent skull before her. But before she could do anything, the skull unleashed a volley of unexpected arrows, wounding her suddenly in the left shoulder. There were many people hidden in the trees, ambushing to support the skull. The skull gleefully told her to lower her head and greet the mother mountain of the northern people. Then she suddenly snorted with laughter. She endured the pain and snapped off the arrows that were stuck in her hand. Only then did she understand why the skull had insisted on going to the northern mountain range. It turned out to be such a silly prank. She forced the skull to tell the others to leave so she could be alone with him. She then waved goodbye, promising they'd meet again for an even more exciting battle. This left the skull helpless, as if Frey had been stunned. At that moment the two other explorers hurried over, helped the skull up, and began asking him questions. Then the skull introduced the people who had helped him to the two of them. But as he was about to call them down to talk, they suddenly aimed their arrows at the skull, leaving him puzzled. The reason that man shot at the skull was that it was the first time they had ever seen a talking skeleton. They even wanted to take him home to soak him in wine. Then the skull suddenly remembered that they had always been real bastards. Confronted with the hostility of those he had trusted, the skull chose to run. It was their best option. At that moment they all rushed to chase the skull, thinking he was an illegal intruder in their forest. Mira, who had thought the skull had reached an agreement with them, suddenly remembered that such deals had been made 100 years ago, which left him speechless. Suddenly the skull had an idea. If he mentioned their names, they might release him. But the three of them were all fugitives, and Harrier in particular had a personal issue with this tribe. So Skull had no choice but to stop. He tried to say his name. He told them his name in hopes of meeting the tribe's leader. When they heard the identity of a member from the northern village, they hesitated to continue their pursuit. It seemed as though everything would go smoothly. Unexpectedly, they decided to lock Skull up in a cell. They did so along with two newly recruited disciples. Harrier sneered, deriding his diplomatic skills. He was promptly struck on the head by Skull. At that, Mira curiously asked for his identity. Harrier put on a serious face, insisting that this wasn't something that could be discussed right now. He had previously held a grudge against this village. The more he thought about it, the angrier Harrier became, and he shouted. Suddenly, someone knocked at the door. They said that their leader wanted to see him. Then all three were dragged away in chains. Looking at the surroundings, Skull still saw that nothing had changed. After speaking with their leader for a while, the leader still didn't believe him, thinking Skull was lying. Then he glanced at the two other explorers to test them. They immediately ignored him, as if they had never known him. At this, Skull pleaded, insisting that he was surely a member of the northern village. But the leader put on a cold, threatening expression toward him, because he had come with the losers, meaning Mira and Harrier, the two who had been expelled from the village. The more he heard the leader's insults, the angrier Skull became. Then he broke his own shackles, thinking they were still old-fashioned about such easy expulsions. The leader, upon hearing this, also flew into a rage and told him that if he knew nothing he should shut up. Then he decided to step forward and deal with Skull. However, Skull showed no fear of him. Upon seeing that massive, hulking figure, suddenly the leader snatched two axes from his seat. Then he rushed down, took up a fighting stance, then swung a slash at Skull. Seeing this, he used just one hand to deflect the leader's strike to the side, aiming to break the shackles on his two disciples' wrists, and told them to fall back. Alone, he faced the leader's aggression. And so the two charged at each other and began to slash, but Skull only dodged the blows and did not counterattack. But the lightning-fast strikes forced even Mira to watch in awe. The leader was skilled, but as for Skull, he was far more skilled, because every strike the leader launched was easily diverted by Skull, and with remarkable skill, the blows grew faster and faster. Yet Skull remained unbowed. The force they generated affected those around them. Skull used only his hands. He could still strike back at the leader, even leaving him motionless for several seconds, making him rage even more. They then went berserk, attacking wildly without any pattern, giving the Skull an opportunity to strike from ambush, and landed a single blow on the leader's shin, sending him flying backward. However, That did not mean the leader was completely defeated. Consumed by fury, instantly teleported over and landed a punch on the skull's right cheek, sending him crashing into the wall. The leader, sturdy in body, thought that someone like the skull, already dead, should be completely gone rather than half alive like this. However, in an instant, a bolt of electricity suddenly shot through him, causing him to stagger back, his body unable to move. At that moment the skull spoke. The dead must of course turn to ashes, and the living must remember them and move on. It was a line he'd heard countless times. And why was the leader, who was still alive, kneeling before him while the dead man stood there proudly? By then the skull was beginning to get angry. He drew his sword and pressed it to the leader's throat, making the leader go pale. He resigned himself to sit quietly and negotiate with the skull. Then the skull sheathed his sword and ordered him to gather all the leaders of the northern villages to join him in attacking the empire. The remark made the leader laugh, but he complied. The meeting would be held soon, and he would bring the skull. But that did not mean he trusted the skull. He told him to wait at Harrier's mansion. However, the skull put on a blank, foolish expression. This made him sigh, thinking the skull's knowledge was limited, or perhaps Harrier hadn't told him anything at all, then told the truth on Harrier's behalf, that his real name was Hawker, from a sister tribe to theirs. The next leader of the White Mane tribe was him. Scene change. This is the territory of the Red Sheep tribe, and so at Harrier's mansion, Dallaw couldn't help widening his eyes, since Harrier had suddenly taken on a refined air. It turned out it was because he was feeling something indescribable, because he no longer wanted anything to do with this house. This made Dallaw and Mura burst out laughing, since the guy who was usually goofy had become aloof in just a minute. A while later, they met the butler Basin. Then they greeted each other. Basin then noticed the girl bowing her head and greeted her. After talking for a while, they learned that Mura and her father were the gardeners of this mansion and servants of Harrier. Then they changed the subject to Harrier. He was the heir of his clan, only temporarily staying with the Red Sheep tribe to learn, and was recognized as a true warrior. At the same time, he learned how to lead the tribe as a future chieftain. However, after many failures during the Great Hunt, 4 years ago, Harrier left the village with Mura, and then the others couldn't bear the shock either and left as well, leaving only Basin here. Seeing this, Dallaw then asked. Then he smiled brightly and said, "I'm here for Harrier, because a house must always be kept clean to be called a home." Both the tribe and Mura were waiting for the day he would return. A while later, Mura and Dallaw went outside to see how she takes care of the bouquets. Suddenly, she switched the subject to her running away with Harrier, not because they were close friends, but rather because, back then, the two of them, father and child, had come to apply for work at Harrier's household, and the one who approved their staying here was Russ, chieftain of the White Lion Mane clan. It turned out that Mura and her father were refugees, who fled here with a faint hope of being saved. And that was how the two of them met. Then Russ suggested that his son show her around, through the White Lion Mane clan's territory. At first Harrier was a bit timid, but when Mura pulled all sorts of antics, Harrier gradually began to feel more at ease, because her jokes were downright crude, making anyone watching panic as well. Even someone as noble as Harrier was baffled, fearing that one day Mura would be punished. But she did not care about that at all. She even explained to him that status doesn't matter when you're replaying together. On top of that, she even made fun of Harrier for being foolish. Having said that, she immediately led him out to have fun, to the commoner's court, and then took turns provoking the wild boars, which had the village children staring wide-eyed after them. Seeing that, Mura invited the whole bunch to play together, and took the chance to introduce Harrier to the village children. She advised him to loosen up, and confidently invite them to join in, and after a while getting acquainted, they gradually became close. Harrier felt that Mura had never flattered him, nor did she butter him up, or try to seek any advantage from him. She didn't see him as the clan chief's son, but saw him for who he truly was. That was the first time in his life Harrier felt he could be a normal person. A few years later, Harrier asked her whether he could shoulder the clan, since he was about to go to the Red Flock clan to study. Then Mura sat up, and confidently told Harrier that he would definitely be able to do it. And so some time later, Harrier as the Lion Cub went to the Red Flock village to study, with strict rules and schedules, placing the entire clan's expectations on him. From physical strength to intellect, he had to do it all perfectly. Even the history of the North, records on monsters, and many other important pieces of information, Harrier was required to learn it all, to the point that he had nosebleeds. His eyes glazed over like an addict. Then negative thoughts began to creep into his mind. But when he thought of Mura, he forced himself to stay clear-headed, to cram that enormous mass of knowledge into his head. And so about a year later, Mura and her father were gardening, when a stranger arrived. Suddenly the flower pot in her hands fell, because the day she met that stranger was the very day she received shocking news that Harrier had run away. Once upon a time, a fairy tale about gathering comrades and slaying the demon king. As always, adults told it to children. The child, filled with admiration for that story, kept it in their heart. The image of a mother holding a shield and gripping a sword to protect everyone, together with the clansfolk following behind his mother. A reverence was engraved deep in his heart, and then, filled with that lofty admiration, the boy had once wished to become like them. He carried that admiration, engraved deep in his heart. Embracing that respect in his hands, he placed his whole life on the tip of his sword, and then, only a shattered boy remained. And so, after the incident, Harrier left home. Mira quickly set out to find him through the heavy snowfall. Baron saw this and pleaded with her to stop, yet like wind passing her ears, she did not hesitate and left with her baggage on her shoulder, ignoring whatever Baron said, for she instinctively knew what she was doing. Despite the snow growing ever thicker outside, each footprint she left was very deep. By then the air had grown even colder, but she suppressed the chill and focused her thoughts solely on Harrier. Scene change, the adventurer's village in the northern continent. Inside a tavern, a rustling sound came from upstairs. None other than Harrier. He was savoring warm drops of liquor sliding into his mouth, when suddenly Mira found him, in the most pitiful state. Yet she did not scorn him. On the contrary, she was worried for him. Then a moment later, she coldly asked why he had run away. Harrier nonchalantly replied that it didn't suit him, so he didn't want to continue, thinking that he lacked talent, and that he had no right to do so. Mira heard that and said nothing, dejectedly approaching him. She then angrily grabbed his collar and hauled him up. Then she shouted in his face, to make him realize the truth he had once yearned to grasp, which he had now so easily abandoned. Harrier only smiled faintly, his eyes hollow, which even surprised Mira. Then Harrier heeded his master's words. The first time is experience, the second is a mistake, the third is stubbornness, and the fourth is the recognition of one's limits. 4 times in all, he had failed the great hunt 4 times. He considered himself pathetic, whether in close quarters or at range. He had no skill at anything, even his use of his wits was pitiful. He thought the only things he had were a keen sense and eyes sharper than most. He had even heard from his master, 1,000 times over, that he wasn't fit to be a warrior. He believed Mira couldn't understand how he felt, when everyone piled their expectations onto him, when he had nothing outstanding of his own falling, standing back up, only to fall again. Hearing that, Mira couldn't help but sympathize with him. It was the reason Harrier had fled here, because it gave him a sense of ease. No master, and no unpleasant eyes watching him. Better to be a cowardly, drunken warrior than to go back there. It made Mira look at Harrier with pity, as she asked whether his failure back then was really what he wanted. He held his head, unsure of what he wanted to become. Harrier's eyes drooped. He spoke heartfelt words from deep within for Mira to hear. And so, 2 years later, in the adventurer's village in the northern continent, Harrier casually picked up his shield. Then he slung it over his back. Together with Mira, the two of them set out on their own path, and became adventurers together. For 2 years Mira stayed by his side, hoping time would heal him. He no longer mentioned his tribe, but Harrier still used that shield, which was proof that he still harbored feelings for his tribe, and Harrier could still change later, if he reached that turning point. Back in the present, Mira chuckled, thinking that when she was with Skull she saw the Harrier of old, and that Skull and Harrier were exactly the same. Then she brought up again that Skull would take both her and Harrier on as disciples. She believed Harrier had talent and strength. He had simply met the wrong master. At that Skull also quietly understood, and then fully agreed with her. Mira had guessed that there was only one thing necessary, by dragging Skull into Harrier's room and breaking Harrier's wings, because she believed that what he needed now was to deal with that tightly closed off heart of his, to find someone who could break it open, to force him to become a version of himself newer than ever. At that moment, Skull grabbed Harrier by the collar and dragged him along, and then didn't forget to give him a soulful wink. Thinking this, Harrier realized that it seemed the two of them had just confided in each other, which was why they dragged him out like this. Then suddenly, the Skull nonchalantly banged against his head. He was a little afraid because of Harrier's mind-reading talent. He then reiterated that he wouldn't teach in jest. Instead, he would formally train an idiot like you. Seeing that, Mira burst out laughing, finding Harrier rather adorable in that foolish state. This left the Skull bewildered, not understanding what was happening. Cut to outside, where the sky was a clear blue. There someone with a prosthetic leg walked along, breathing heavily. He went around the village calling each person's name, but no one answered. He looked himself over, thinking he couldn't just return to Valhalla like that, because he was the only one left alive. They had all been killed. They were none other than the Empire's savage wolves. Cut to a scene at the leaders' meeting. Harrier is absent, because he had to undergo the training the Skull imposed. However, the leader believes it's pointless, because Harrier is just a worthless brat. But the Skull thinks he has great potential, and that the leader is far inferior to him, which drives him to rage, cursing that bone-faced fool. Just as tensions peak between them, a hurried call comes from outside. The leader then has the person admitted. It turns out to be someone who lost a leg trudging through the night snow. The man kneels, begging the leader to order an attack to avenge his front line, but the leader flatly refuses, saying war would cause devastating losses. Avoiding battle is the wisest course, and he tells the man to return to his post and continue the mission. The man, furious and humiliated, rants loudly. Investigation reveals he is the sole survivor of the Coastal Defense Unit. Recently there was a massive ambush there. After that attack, the defense unit was reduced to about 10 men. Despite his crushed leg, the survivor was determined to fight to the end, but when respect was given to the survivor, it meant others had to die right there, and right before his eyes. In the end, the survivors remained bound to that horrific moment. The graves hold only empty coffins. On the battlefield, collecting the dead is a luxury. Northern warriors weep for comrades left to rot on past fields. Cut to the skull and Mura strolling and talking. He thinks she is qualified to be a northern warrior. In strength and intellect she is flawless. He suspects she faked failure in the great hunt because of Harrier, and Harrier failed because he trapped himself in the shadow of being the leader's son. The skull believes the most important factor in forming strength is a warrior's will. He once wondered how to teach that. You can't know it without experiencing. Perhaps his role is to bring advice from the past to the present, and the skull still has many shortcomings in training disciples, but he believes he can tame Harrier, letting him realize he can be an outstanding warrior among thousands. 7 days later at the northern mountain gate, Frey lets out a big yawn, sprawled out watching his subordinates eat snow. Suddenly Dawn appears behind, teasing her subordinates. They may look dumb, but each of them is 1 against 100. Then she asks Dawn outright whether he came to negotiate or to claim the title of the 4th knight. Dawn coldly says he's only here to deal with that commanding sorcerer, implying the skull. Dawn wonders why Frey's group isn't entering the range and is staying here. Frey smiles devilishly, saying if he waits they'll entertain her themselves. Dawn was so bored he didn't want to continue speaking, because he personally lacked patience. At that moment a knight came forward to inform the group that they would advance toward the northern mountains, under the command of Dawn, a war-crazed man. Meanwhile, at the skull's side, he went to the tower, drew back the curtain, and anxiously asked the leader about the situation. The leader reported that Imperial forces had penetrated the mountain range. A large army was surging in from the coast, as if to overturn the mountains. Although he had sent messengers to call the other tribes, it was already too late. Whether he liked it or not, the leader had to confront them. Then the skull stepped forward, offering to lend his strength to fight the Empire and the Red Sheep, Harrier's village. In the biting cold of winter, blood had warmed it, balancing the temperature. Between the Red Sheep and the Empire, the battle raged fiercely. The skull stood high above, looking down. Though he'd stood on battlefields hundreds of times, he felt an odd strangeness deep inside. This time he stood on the field with reverence alongside his new comrades. While lost in thought, a survivor suddenly ran up. He staggered forward on unsteady leg, wanting to contribute what strength he could to the fight. But the skull asked the survivor whether he dreamed of avenging his comrades, probing him. The survivor firmly declared he fought out of duty, as a shield for the Red Sheep, that he was only ashamed for failing to complete his duty. The skull then conceived a plan to call the fallen back from their rest. If he did so, would the survivor's comrades curse him? The survivor bluntly called that a shameful dark art. But if there was a just cause for the homeland, then it was a longing everyone would wish to fulfill. After hearing his confession, the skull reached out his hand in offer. Lend me your banner for a moment, will you? He brightened at the request, seized the skull's hand, and agreed to the plan. The skull then blessed the Red Sheep clan. Suddenly a great light appeared, so sudden it dazzled everyone. The survivor slowly opened his eyes, gazing toward the blinding light. He unexpectedly saw his comrades in skeletal form. Now from death, the heroes had returned. A war cry rang out as the defense unit's banner soared across the sky. Another order rang out telling the coastal defense to fall back immediately, while the army of undead kept advancing. Each breath they exhaled released a gust of cold air. A streak of light flashed. Immediately after, a sword cleaved the head of the creature before the undead army in two. The man fell, blood spraying, while the other fiends stood fierce, gripping the bloodied sword. Quickly those behind scrambled forward in haste. With a thud a sturdy shield was planted into the ground. Then shields were set down and stacked upon one another to form a massive barrier. The survivor watched everything, tears streaming, his expression stunned and open-mouthed. He clenched his sword, raised it as high as he could, placed his other hand over his heart, and shouted to the fallen about his loss, and to those remaining about their loss. A unit of mounted soldiers, each with a spear and shield, charged straight ahead. The thunder of hooves grew louder as they closed on the great shield of the undead army. A fiend spotted them through a gap. In the next instant, countless small objects shot out from those gaps at blinding speed, piercing even the bodies of the horses. At the same time, an arm reached out and a confession to the spirit of the great Mother Mountain rang out. It was the skull. He pressed his arm to his temple, pleading for his wish to be granted. Then he turned his head and spoke to someone. It turned out to be Harrier, who was bewildered and astonished. The skull looked down at the chaos below and continued a torrent of words. Then he called Harrier, asking him to prove his earlier answer on the real battlefield. The demand made Harrier's eyes widen in shock as he repeated the phrase, "The real battlefield," from the skull. He pictured how brutal that place must be, the place where slaughter could take lives at any moment. The skull didn't face Harrier directly, revealing only half his face, doubting whether he could do it. Harrier bowed his head, intending to accept it as his due, but before he could finish, the skull snapped his fingers, causing Harrier to lean back, stunned into silence. The skull did not withdraw his hovering arm, but softly explained that war brings responsibility and a great curse upon those who join it, in truth awakening him not to turn away from tragedy and guilt. Then he lightly punched Harrier's chest as if offering all encouragement for him to complete his task. The skull walked on, leaving Harrier bewildered, not understanding why his master moved forward so readily. Below, countless mutilated bodies lay motionless on the ground. Frey also appeared, bearing a large blade. She glanced, opened her mouth, and laughed loudly with contempt. With hollow, dull eyes like a demon, she tauntingly mentioned the immortal army. Suddenly a large patch of snow burst upward above as if someone had leaped up. It was the skull. He shouted for Harrier to advance while he prepared to land where Frey stood. Sure enough, the skull lunged down with a powerful strike but was blocked by Frey's great blade. Harrier now put his mask on. His gaze sharpened until his pupils flashed. He had begun to act, telling himself he was a northern warrior. A knight on horseback swung an arm, shouted down orders to fire, and ordered the shield unit to advance and form ranks. Immediately the mages and infantry fell into orderly formation, ready for battle. No matter how numerous or formidable the enemy ranks, Harrier charged forward alone without fear. In the next instant a massive energy shot from the mage's staff toward Harrier as he leapt forward. The soldiers were stunned, eyes wide at his astonishing ability. He propelled himself with terrifying force and incredible speed, never slowing. With a sweep of his arm the knight on horseback was cleaved from shoulder to belly. A spray of blood poured out, while Harrier landed lightly and safely on the ground. Mura, watching, couldn't hide his shock, dumbfounded that Harrier's moves were so different than usual. Supple as if boneless yet muscles taut, that person was Harrier. Meanwhile Frey and the skull continued their duel, her face stern as she urged the skull to focus on her. In Mura's eyes appeared the clan chief's image, identical to Harrier's current stance, perhaps because he revered his mother like an idol, but his actions bore a subtle, intangible difference. His primary skill was one-on-one combat, feint then deliver a killing blow. At that moment a soldier was pierced by Harrier's thrown knife through a small exposed gap. Ignoring the two nearby who hadn't reacted, Harrier lunged, pinned the skewered man down, and sliced across the necks of the other two. Another fiend coldly glanced at Harrier, appraising him. He noted Harrier showed no fear in combat, and notably that he and Harrier were both double variants. Outside the duel the battle raged fiercely as both sides kept striking with decisive blows. That fiend watched Harrier's retreating back and seemed to deduce his identity as a northern warrior. Suddenly the skull sounded alarmed, loudly reminding everyone to focus on the fight. At the same time Frey wanted the same. She leapt from behind intending to kick the skull. Unlucky for Frey, the skull deftly dodged, and she was displeased he kept losing focus in battle. Frey tightened her fist, full of murderous intent, and half in doubt, half in contempt, asked if he wasn't afraid to die. The skull refused to yield and immediately swung back. They moved with such speed the eye could not follow, trading blows in rapid succession. Then it seemed someone made a mistake. Unexpectedly it was the skull who took a full punch from Frey straight into his empty skull. She grabbed the skull's collar and effortlessly hoisted him up. A loud bang sounded like a great explosion had just occurred. Hearing the enormous noise, Harrier turned, astonished, and looked toward him. A chill breath exhaled from him. With a single swing, nearly a dozen knights were cleaved in two. Harrier crouched slightly as if about to launch at arrow speed. Sure enough, his feet left the ground. Suddenly Mura lunged in, surprising Harrier who turned to look back. Mura quietly warned him not to be careless. Harrier murmured his thanks. Another person appeared, bearing a large scar on his cheek. It was Doan carrying a great sword, his dark face and cold eyes full of resentment toward Frey. Harrier and Mura both saw him and became highly alert, readying for combat. Doan stroked his sword, his gaze seemed sharper than the blade. He targeted Harrier and Mura, treating them as an hors d'oeuvre before attacking the skull. Doan strode forward, looking down on the two rookies, Harrier and Mura. His voice grew louder and deeper as he barked at them, calling them Enlu. With one swing, Doan forced them to stagger back several meters. Mira's eyes widened in astonishment at Doan's movement. But Harrier stayed calm and softly told her to get used to it, since they'd have to fight like this often. A wonderful sensation filled Harrier as his fears melted away, leaving only trembling nerves. He ran and leapt freely at unseen speed. Seeing Harrier's actions, Doan's face darkened with displeasure. The image of the skull flashed through his mind. His brow tightened and the veins on his face stood out with fury at the memory. In the next instant, Doan slammed his blade into the ground, carving 4 clear gashes. Harrier nimbly dodged. Doan exhaled sharply and stooped forward. Harrier guessed Doan would strike after that breath, and quickly seized the chance to call to Mira. She immediately raised her weapon, ready at any moment. Right after that, Harrier sprang forward, and Doan found this rather interesting. Doan once again keenly recognized Harrier as a northern warrior from that move. He smiled, the scar reaching his mouth making the grin all the more grotesque. Suddenly Harrier froze, eyes wide as he sensed something off in that breathing rhythm. It turned out Doan's breath hadn't ended. He was merely coiling to unleash a strike. Less than a second later, his roaring knight's move launched like a beast at Harrier. A spray of blood flew out had Harrier been hit. His vision blurred as memories he shared with Mira surfaced. He remembered childhood days, always fascinated by tales of northern warriors, always singing and running about for them, perhaps influenced by his mother. A small streak of blood splattered across Harrier's mask. It turned out the one hit wasn't Harrier but Mira, who rushed forward and hugged him, taking the pain herself, which left Harrier both shocked and even angrier. On this side, explosions of various sizes rang out. The skull and Frey faced each other from opposite sides. They sprinted forward, closing the distance. With only a few steps left, they both raised their weapons to strike. Frey wildly swung down in a decisive, powerful slash, but the skull easily dodged. He stepped back several paces while she chased with her blade. She launched another slash, which the skull again evaded by leaping away. Frey thrilled, grinned and began slashing rapidly at her opponent. The skull, though clumsy in appearance, was agile and parried each blow. Then her foot spun on the ground for some unknown purpose, which left the skull momentarily stunned. Before he could react, Frey closed in even faster. Even her subordinates were sent to their deaths, used as stepping stones, just so she could toy with the skull. Having taken a direct hit, the skull staggered, his heart skipping a beat. Before this crazed, berserk woman, the moment her ultimate move finished, Frey strolled over her comrades' corpses, her feet stained with blood, but she didn't care. She was annoyed at the skull for having the chance to dodge yet staying to shield his comrades, which made her curious about this so-called comradeship in war. But the skull didn't answer. He pointed at her feet and told her to look after her own men first. Frey acted as if nothing had happened, pretending to glance down like a normal person. Then she looked up with a wide grin, thinking her troops were just meat under her feet, not worth her concern. What she cared about was something else. She curiously asked why he kept switching hands to strike, questioning if he had to sheathe his sword even when punching. She grew irritated, disliking his sloppy fighting style, as if he hadn't been a mage before, but rather someone who fought on the battlefield in a more hands-on style. She analyzed everything as if the skull were in the palm of her hand, which even earned the skull's reluctant praise. He looked dumb, but was surprisingly clever. Then she shifted the topic to Doan. He looked like trash, yet he was captain of a guild, though still subordinate to her. As soon as she finished speaking, Frey leapt up, closing in tightly on the skull's movements, which left the skull momentarily taken aback. Instantly, Frey's slashes rose, slaughtering nearby soldiers, even her own men, all to satisfy her bloodlust. Frey closed in on the skull, and both excited and contemptuous, asked how he planned to escape again. Just as the blade swept through, the skull was nowhere to be seen. From his angle he had looked up from below and missed, leaving her momentarily stunned. But to her surprise, the skull lying on the ground had sliced Frey's calf. She stared blankly, eyes wide, and looked down at her leg. She rested the blade on her shoulder, and lifted her leg to inspect the wound, then quickly returned to her indifferent manner. She didn't hold back praise, softly commending the skull's quick dodge. He muttered that she was like a madwoman. The skull realized he had an opening to attack, but the strike was too shallow. With his old sword it might have been different. Frey coolly brushed her hair, puzzled why the skull's blows had so many flaws, as if he were a beat slow. She guessed the skull couldn't strike hard, because that blade was too heavy, while with other weapons he cut easily, and she struggled. Meanwhile Harrier supported the wounded body, stunned, calling her name. Seeing the skull distracted by Harrier and Mira, Frey clenched her teeth in annoyance. She thrust her fist right in front of him. He didn't dodge, so Frey punched him hard and sent him flying backward. With a crash, dust billowed as the skull hit the ground, aided by Frey's punch. His face darkened and he said nothing, but Frey kept nagging that he was cold-hearted. She went cold, her empty gaze recalling the lives already and yet to be lost on this battlefield. Only then did Frey's eyes grow icy as she looked down at the skull, and accused him of not glancing at the fallen even once. The skull lifted his dark eyes to Frey and offered no rebuttal. Deep down he agreed with her reproach, and he sat there dazed for a long time, sinking into silence and blaming himself for his cruelty. So many corpses lay outside, and he hadn't looked at them, unable to save a single one. Then an invisible hand wrapped his head, reminding him it wasn't his fault, because their sacrifices had many causes, including that they slaughtered each other out of greed. A voice in his head kept urging him to let go and accept. The past surged back. The skull had once drawn his sword for this world. Those hands kept placing themselves on him and covering his eyes, reminding him of the pain of being discarded by this world. Another voice, not from those hands, called him back. It seemed to be an old memory with Mura, the skull standing opposite her. He stood there as if standing in the dark. Mura laughed because the skull felt guilty that his homeland was dragged into war. She stroked her chin thoughtfully and said it wasn't the skull's fault, that the attackers were the bastards. Her eyes brightened as she consoled him, saying they were all just warriors so he needn't apologize. She left a half smile and glanced at the skull, her tone teasing. Then Mura smiled like a gentle flower and offered a simple, pointed suggestion: just step onto the battlefield. In the end, she coaxed him again not to blame himself. The skull then seemed to awaken. At that moment Frey prepared to rush in from behind the skull with her blade raised. The skull now realized he himself was a northern warrior, and gripped his sword tightly. In that deep mysterious sky, a small step still had to be taken. As a northern warrior pursuing the shadow of a hero, the skull would not allow himself to falter. Seeing he made no move, Frey grew irritated. She plunged down from the sky, her slash creating a huge explosion, but the skull did not dodge. He stood there, splitting his sword in two and striking upward at his foe, causing her to take massive damage to her shoulder, without her even realizing it. She hadn't expected his sword could split in two. Such versatility. The skull smirked coldly, taunting her, then spun forcefully, combining with his blades to form a vortex. And in a flash, the mountain-breaking devastation slash was unleashed, sending her flying 10,000 miles. Only then did she realize the skull had never been a mage but a dual swordsman, which made her even more delighted. Before she could recover, the skull launched continuous attacks at her, aiming so she couldn't counterattack in time. Then he quickly rushed forward again, slashing at her relentlessly, forcing her to endure the full barrage. Frey began to resent this dual-wielding style. Suddenly a mocking voice echoed in her ear, pathetic. Someone who doesn't understand the pain of death calls himself a knight on the battlefield. Both arrogant and pitchable. It drove her into a fury as if about to go rabid. Seeing this, the skull quickly retreated. When the mechanism sensed danger, Frey's body would move on its own, executing the ultimate heaven-piercing, earth-cleaving strike toward the enemy, right in front of the skull. He reassured himself that though he had no flesh, only white bones, he could still recreate it. That moment recalled the hero of old, the one who once felled the Demon King, swinging that keen blade once more. The technique Northern martial art, Battle Hunt, was executed. The skull instantly merged into the fight, forming a blinding streak atop the ice peak. The scene shifted to where beasts and knights fought chaotically beneath the mountain. Suddenly a shrill sound rang from the highest summit. Then the peak was cleft into fragments. Chunks of mountain, big and small, tumbled down as the silhouette of the skull flashed by. A thunderous crash exploded like a great detonation. Over here Harrier bowed his head, speaking softly with Mura. His eyes opened wide as if to take Mura's whole being into them. Mura's body on the ground was smeared with blood everywhere, the puncture wounds continuously bleeding before Harrier's eyes. Yet Mura still opened her blood-filled mouth as if trying to say something to Harrier. Seeing this, he begged her not to speak to conserve strength, then seethed because her blood wouldn't stop flowing. Suddenly something appeared, driving Harrier into agony as he pleaded for everything to return to how it was. Nothing would stop, and he clutched Mura's ruined body, screaming for her not to die. Doan's footsteps gradually approached, his voice laced with mockery at Harrier's weeping over his fallen comrade. He held his sword, looked down at Harrier frozen over Mura, and cursed him as useless. Then his shock turned to clenched teeth and glare when Harrier declared war on him. Harrier hugged Mura's body tightly, his voice deep and hoarse as he looked straight at Doan and vowed he would die by his hand. Hearing this, Doan grew furious, furrowing his brow, eyes wide until veins stood out. His face darkened like the bottom of a pot as he swung a fist at Harrier's head. But then his face registered a stunned, bewildered expression. Was it from seeing Harrier's true face after crushing his mask, or from Harrier's murderous gaze, unafraid even with blood trickling from his head? Yet he remained kneeling there clutching Mura with no intention to rise or let go, while Doan stood and continued to insult him. Then Doan drew back to prepare another punch at Harrier. A howl rang out in Harrier's silent agony. Then a cloud of dust erupted as Harrier was punched and sent flying a few meters. From the dust a voice sounded, lightly questioning. and a familiar-looking weapon appeared. It was the skull. He stood before Harrier holding two swords while Harrier, still dazed, clutched Mura. Harrier stammered, calling the skull's name. Doan pushed himself up from where he'd fallen, his eyes full of killing intent as he sneered aloud. The skull left Harrier a reminder to stay calm. The skull said he would help Harrier a little, then urged him again to keep his cool and stay level-headed. Seeing the skull appear, Doan wasn't very surprised since Frey couldn't hold him back and had taunted earlier that the skull was cold-hearted at the sight of fallen comrades. He glared at the skull and spat a string of vicious words to provoke him. But those words seemed useless now, for the skull just stood there silently. He mentioned the Empire's knights, dying at the hands of the skull's men. How pitiful they were, reminding that they had families and homes to return to, like the skull once did, likely meant to drown the skull in past sorrow. Suddenly the skull replied that he too felt a certain remorse. But he went further, pointing out that Doan's coldness came from never once regarding those people. Then the skull recalled Free's words from earlier. He took slow, deliberate steps forward, and now the skull stood right before Doan, the two separated by only a small step. Doan glanced down at the skull. He looked up at him as well. Then strikes from both sides were launched almost simultaneously. The skull's attack forced Doan to block with his sword. The skull's loud voice kept proclaiming that cruelty is the essence of war. The gaze from behind Doan's blade remained cold and merciless as it stared at the skull. One of the skull's eyes flashed. His voice still aimed back toward where Harrier knelt holding Mura. At last her arm relaxed gently. The skull urged him to make his decision quickly. Then strange lights shone across the peak, each beam leaving a faint trail of destruction. Now Harrier likely made his choice. He softly called Mura's name and laid her down. Glancing at the skull fighting Doan, he quickly decided to call the medics. Unbelievably, despite the dire state, Mura was still alive and told Harrier not to worry about her. Harrier, stunned and worried, told her not to strain herself, but Mura insisted he go help the skull. Mura's trembling hand reached out as if to grasp something. She grabbed Harrier's collar, and he ground his teeth in helplessness. Then Mura, using her last strength, shouted for him never to forget his role, leaving Harrier speechless. Afterwards she opened her mouth and breathed heavily. Her hand still reached, trying to touch the sight before her but could not. That hand hung there, suspended in the air. Finally it rested on Harrier's silent face. Tears flowed from Mura's bright, glistening eyes, and this time those hands truly fell to the cold ground, unable to lift again, leaving Harrier to painfully watch her slowly leave this world. As for the skull, he continued fighting Doan without pause. This time he used the Northern March technique to attack his opponent. Doan did not cower before the skull's blows. Instead he roared that he was weak, guessing the fight with Frey had worn him down. The skull only stared at him without saying a word. Then Doan lunged, kicking toward the skull with a contemptuous smile. But the skull easily dodged and replied that Harrier would not fall. Doan seemed intent on throwing another kick. This time it appeared to carry more force than before. The skull could only utter a few words in response to the situation. Then he prepared to rush back into battle with Doan. Confident Harrier was a true northern warrior. The skull planned to spring forward, but for some reason Doan's twisted smile reappeared. He lowered his eyes as if he had caught his prey, the one he had been targeting for a long time. Suddenly a long slash from shoulder to belly appeared on Doan, halting his next actions, and that cut was none other than Harrier's. Then he swung his sword horizontally once more. At this point the two were still quite far apart. The skull was astonished to see him standing there ready to fight. Harrier's face had become extremely serious without him knowing, likely from regaining his composure. Suddenly a gush of blood spurted. Doan glared at Harrier, one eye streaming red blood, furious and berating him. He didn't respond, only lightly raised a hand to smooth his hair. The yellow pupil flared like a wounded beast as Harrier coldly declared a swat. Though wounded, Doan was still brimming with fury, grinding his teeth to kill Harrier. The skull behind lightly knelt on one knee, calling him but saying nothing. Doan and Harrier moved ever closer to each other. Doan raised his sword. Harrier kept unleashing attack after attack. Doan swung a sharp slash forward, but Harrier jumped to dodge. They charged at each other to fight, while the skull remained silent. The clashing of their swords rang relentlessly. This move from Doan came down hard toward Harrier. He nimbly pulled out his shield to block the blow. His gaze was cold, staring at Doan like a predator eyeing its prey. The shield shattered, so he tossed it away and plunged back into the fight. The two pairs of eyes held distinctly different emotions. Then another loud sound rang out. A spray of blood burst, piercing the dust cloud. Unexpectedly both had impaled the other with their swords. Yet unlike Harrier's shock, Doan curled his lips in smug satisfaction. A sword was lodged in Harrier's belly, and the other sword had pierced Doan. Harrier pressed the remaining blade further into Doan's body. Doan seized the chance to land a heavy punch to Harrier's face. Then Doan shouted in Harrier's face to drop his sword or they would both die. Harrier, stunned as if struck silly, opened his eyes wide and parted his lips but said nothing. Then he clenched his teeth as if about to do something huge. A moment later he screamed with wide, staring eyes at his opponent. Then Harrier slowly withdrew his sword. Doan's wounded eye immediately darkened, and he coughed from the pain, and he decisively pulled his sword out of Harrier. The skull behind, seeing this, panicked and called Harrier. Seconds later Doan slashed horizontally. Fortunately Harrier bent down in time to avoid it. The sword in his hand was raised once more, his eyes razor sharp. Harrier launched a low attack at the legs, but Doan anticipated it and jumped up. Suddenly from behind the skull's sword it pierced straight into Doan's body. He angrily turned and cursed, the other eye webbed with blood. The skull still held the posture of launching its sword toward Doan. Then he called Harrier. Suddenly below, where the soldiers of both sides were fighting, a magic array appeared. Then a white tent materialized. Inside was a map and voices discussing the battle. The skull loudly ordered his army to urgently retreat. But one of them was still attacked by a knight. Another turned his head to look back. Doan, realizing he'd been duped from the start, grew furious. But what else could he do when his wounds were far from minor? And Harrier shouted down that this was the decisive moment. Returning his gaze sharper than ever, he then used the northern march technique. Immediately Doan's body was split in two. Each step Harrier took melted the snow beneath him. A large pool of blood spread. Then Harrier panted a few breaths. He stood there facing up at the sky, which strangely seemed dark. On this side the skull did not stand idly either. While Harrier was still dazed why the skull shouted so loud, he had no idea a snowslide was about to crash down behind him. The skull kept trying to shout his name. Harrier stared blankly ahead without turning back. Then the mountains were no longer covered in snow. A sound rang out like a question, and at the same time an odd sigh. Strangely before him was a crystal ball showing the same scene from earlier with Harrier, and a hand imprinted with some formation. A majestic mountain scene with white clouds appeared before him. On the ground corpses lay in heaps that was Escher Soma's entire vanguard. A blood-stained axe appeared before them. At the same time the chieftain spoke up, questioning the empire's stupidity. It turned out the one holding the bloodied axe was the leader. Hearing the chieftain's question he was helpless, unable to understand what had happened. Stepping over the piles of corpses, the chieftain and the leader moved forward. Smack, a handclap between two surviving soldiers helped them up. The battle ended after the drum signaled. The survivors searched for each other among the corpses. Suddenly footsteps approached. The survivor looked up and before him stood an imposing army of revenants. A revenant appeared in the likeness of a deceased person. Though they had lost life, they still fought fiercely as revenants. He looked up to welcome the light. Standing beneath the banner representing the revenant army, white smoke rose from their ranks. They all removed their helmets and vanished with the wind. The survivor and the skull looked up following the drifting smoke. Ordinary spirit calling summons are just corpses that can use weapons. Compared to the army that vanished, the revenant force carried wills and fought shoulder to shoulder as they did in life. The smoke fading over time made the skull consider seeing them all. The leader stepped forward, raising both hands to remove his iron helmet to stop the skull from taking the army's bodies away. He spoke coldly, eyes sharp, telling the skull that they had fallen right here. Indeed, for northerners, resting where one fell is an honor, and if the skull now tried to move them they likely would not be pleased. On this side Harrier bowed his head, retching from the shock of those around him. The scene shifted to a house in a dense forest with memories of life from childhood to now. The skull fell silent as if realizing something. Looking toward the mountain clouds over the battlefield, he confessed that they were all like that. The leader stepped behind the dazed Harrier and called to him. He didn't turn but only answered softly, gazing at the towering peaks. The leader encouraged Harrier and thanked him and the girl, apologizing for not recognizing their talent. The leader stood there and continued to ask Harrier questions. Harrier raised his hand, then clenched it to show the losses and gains after the brutal war. Harrier bowed his head, hugging himself while the leader behind urged him to return to the village. That night the sky lit with multicolored fireworks, and the snow-covered village below gradually came into view. Villagers celebrated joyfully. The two veterans raised mugs and spoke of their glorious deeds. Beside Harrier the skull sat against a wall corner watching the villagers toast. Suddenly Harrier mentioned how such funerals made him nostalgic. Watching villagers dance under fireworks made Harrier think of southern funeral rites. Harrier glanced at the skull, who was explaining northern funeral customs. The skull leaned against the wall and spoke of the pain of loss without shedding a tear. Head bowed, voice heavy, the skull still wanted Harrier to understand why funerals could be joyful. Harrier held his aching remaining arm with one hand, listening to the skull speak. Harrier's expression brightened when he mentioned Muron. Looking toward Harrier, the skull raised a hand and spoke of Muron. The two talked together about the people around them. They would be furious if hatred blinded them. Harrier's rough, Bandaged arm reached out along with the skull's words. Before Harrier, everyone still danced happily. He bowed his head, fearing he would lose himself. Beside him the skull sat too, sharing Harrier's empathy about his identity. The skull suddenly stood, grabbed a beer mug from a villager while Harrier watched. Holding the cup, he turned and invited Harrier. Speaking of the burden on their shoulders, he downed the beer in one go and chose the path he would take. Turning to Harrier with the empty beer mug in his hand, he wanted him to smile for Muran. Harrier blinked back tears and looked at the skull gently. After speaking, the skull left Harrier sitting alone and stood to handle business. Watching the skull's back recede, Harrier wiped a tear with his sleeve. He slowly lowered his hand to reveal sorrowful eyes and whispered about his master. The skull's silhouette appeared with thoughts about Harrier's sense of self toward the skull. The distant back of the skull bore the great responsibilities and ambitions he carried. Harrier sat stunned, staring and wondering what he should do. Cut to 2 days later in a meeting room filled with people at the table. Harrier and the skull approached and questioned the empty seats. The leader, face cold and eyes sharp, looked at Harrier and the skull and explained why the table lacked attendees. Rexar, cloaked and hooded tightly, revealed red eyes as he glanced at the skull. He greeted them and introduced himself. Harrier and the skull whispered to each other about Rexar, who had just spoken. An old woman called the seer stepped closer to the skull. The seer took the skull's hands and entrusted him with an object. In the skull's hand was a wooden talisman the seer had given, which would aid him in the future. Their hands remained clasped together. While holding his hands, the seer spoke strange words about the ancestors. Elsewhere, the leader turned to the seer and the skull. Puzzled by what the seer said, the skull showed clear fatigue, while the seer told the leader about what she mentioned, refusing to reveal more. The seer bowed toward the skull as Harrier stood silent. The leader pointed to the seer and spoke of the alliance of the clans. Suddenly a voice rose and a foot stepped down, approaching the skull, who stood clasping his hands and watching. Frey approached, chained with ropes held by others. She was a prisoner. Frey stepped close to the skull and called him bone dry. With a fierce face, dark eyes, and a wicked smile, she wanted to join the skull's fight. A massive red wooden house. The skull was puzzled why Frey had willingly been captured. Then she gave a devilish smile and said she wished to submit and only wanted to join the skull's battle. But Harrier waved his hand in objection. Because she was one of the Empire's 4 knights, their enemy, she abused her position to back colonial vassals, and when they grew strong she led her troops to ravage them, driven by her lust for battle. Then the skull snapped, pointed at her face, and called her a madwoman. The skull wondered why she wanted to join their side. She collapsed and cried that she acted for the sake of war. But she grew disillusioned because looking around there was only the skull and a few lackeys, hardly enough to stand against the Empire. The Empire had strategic cavalry and vast untrained infantry conscripted from its populace, a sea of people with axes at a moment's notice. And that was why Rexar was even more curious about her motives. She bluntly said that the skull's side was much more fun. When you utterly dominate, war becomes boring, which made her extremely frustrated. The excitement only appears when both sides are evenly matched or one is slightly disadvantaged. That stimulates and awakens the perversion inside her. Harrier vehemently objected upon hearing that, but the skull's next move made Harrier protest even more fiercely. He couldn't believe the skull would actually accept her into his side. Suddenly the leader slammed the table and stood, insisting Frey was dangerous and decisions couldn't be made lightly. The skull argued he understood people like her. Nothing holds them back except war. Then he turned to reassure Harrier. He wanted him to stay clear-headed, not let anger override reason. Be cold, passionate, and iron-willed. That's how a commander wins. He even taunted Harrier to stir his fighting spirit, saying he was overly proud yet insecure about his strength. Hearing this, Rexar agreed with what the skull had said. Then the skull continued. If you want to protect your comrades and the Empire, even with demonic power, if victory is assured he won't hesitate to use it. One day Harrier will also become chieftain. You shouldn't be so rigid. The skull's words are meant for your good. Making him uneasy, he had no choice but to comply. Frey giggled at their talk, claiming the skull must have faced death many times to say such things. But he surpassed that his whole life had been lived on battlefields. After a while the table resumed business. Frey was strong, but the leader adamantly opposed uncontrolled mercenaries for fear they'd betray them one day. Then he looked to the skull to probe how he would control them. The skull hid nothing, but spoke with eyes half closed, which made Frey irritatedly curious. So the leader reluctantly agreed to follow the skull's plan. They would rest briefly, and then continue the discussion. After everyone else left, now only the chieftain remained in the room, and one more person, Basin. He teasingly asked the woman if they'd already exchanged greetings. She coldly told Basin to hold his tongue, yet he went on babbling about Harrier's training. The chieftain forced a smile, saying her son resembled his father more than her, then ordered Basin to give this blade to Harrier. "This is your father's sword." She hesitated, saying he probably thought he was inheriting her legacy when he clung to that shield. There was one thing the chieftain always regretting that she had been too distant from her son. Yet in her heart she always urged Harrier onward, that he should advance because the white-maned lion clan stood behind him. At Harrier's house, buried in white snow, a bouquet of white flowers was placed on Mura's grave. His heart felt heavy thinking about the clan's distant future, but he believed himself too weak, not worth a fraction of Mura, always letting emotions rule him. And Mura's dream was to one day see him become chieftain. If his ambition outgrew that dream, he would not deserve to be chieftain. Harrier decided his next path. He would become great chief, grander and more magnificent, to be more worthy of the name his mother gave him, and especially for Mura, the girl he loved. Standing at the grave, he stared in silence for a moment. Then Basin approached, holding the blade the chieftain had instructed him to bring. Basin then handed it to Harrier, and said this was the sword your father used in life, which left him stunned for a moment. Basin thought that with his current strength Harrier would easily survive the great hunt, become an excellent chieftain leading them, and carve his name into northern history. But Basin regretted one thing, whether he'd follow the skull or stay. He believed the skull had the vision of a great general. Following him would teach new things. The great hunt could wait, and urged Harrier to go quickly and find what he wanted. After hearing him, he sheathed the blade at his hip, and asked Basin to look after his family while he was away. Suddenly Basin wondered why the skull was here, and Harrier turned away, saying the next meeting would likely be long. After some discussion, the skull needed a navy, but the leader's naval squad was all show. Even the leader and the skull were helpless before these three dark-skinned men, yet they were the only northern tribe with sailors, so the leader had to use them when needed. They mastered sea combat and were called the sea ghosts of the coastal reaches, very powerful. Unfortunately, they were a bit slow-witted. The dark-skinned man threw an arm over the skull's shoulder, prattling about the sea's virtues to entice him, but the skull decided we travel by land, leaving the dark-skinned man stunned, wailing incessantly. When the leader asked why he chose land, he replied, "I have a place to stop by." The leader said little more and stopped prying into the skull's affairs. Elsewhere, Harrier decided he would go to the swordsmith village, and so would the skull. Both shared the same goal. They moved together toward the smith's quarter. At the village gate, a shadowy crowd had gathered, whispers rising with mystery. The leader stepped forward, clasped Skullhead's hand, and sincerely wished him safety before the negotiation with the village chief. Skullhead quietly stared at him for a moment, then gently returned the blessing of safety. Harrier was about to slip away but froze at a sharp call from his companion. Seeing the teenager's wary face made the leader a bit embarrassed. He scratched his head and hesitantly gave Harrier a few warnings. He now looked like a child, standing obediently while the leader warned him to be careful of the skull beside him. The leader whispered to his ear about the hidden corners of Skull's past. Each crack in Harrier's emotions was gradually soaked by the thin confidences the leader reserved for him. Breeze passed, revealing his extreme surprise when he finished hearing Skull's life story and the detailed warnings. The image of Skull breaking all barriers to step into the vast universe awakened Harrier, filling him with deep admiration. He tightened the shoulder strap of his pack and murmured words of reverent praise. After rambling on, the leader folded his arms and advised him to hold fast to an upright person like Skull for a chance to follow that hero's path. His mouth gently curved into a smile, full of delight at that suggestion. Suddenly, a sigh and a grumble of annoyance came from someone nearby. Frey complained as she walked that the heavy shackles slowed her down, while Skull, walking ahead, looked smug and turned back to tease her. Skull, tired of her complaints, turned and mocked her, saying she's a four-knight yet so talkative. She wasn't like this a few days ago. Frey shook herself and hummed martial tunes that visibly irritated him. Harrier's helpless, speechless look was clear as he had to travel with these two noisy people. While walking in silence, the three suddenly encountered a massive monster blocking the path. After dealing with it and moving on cheerfully, the three quickly crossed a lush green meadow. As they strode on, they ran into an ugly monster crawling up from a steaming lava pool. Days passed as the three hunched and trudged over a towering mountain. In a withered grassland, the three were again blocked by an enraged, rampaging bull. A few more days on, the three trailed each other under a sky full of glittering stars. After much walking, one of them caught a wild rabbit. The one holding it praised the excellent dinner prospect. As soon as Skull's suggestion to stop took effect, Harrier dropped his heavy backpack by a nearby tree, while Free yawned tiredly. The fire flickered in the dark, casting the travelers' silhouettes into view. Sitting to one side, Free gave a strange smile and curiously asked how Skull and his companions had found her. Seeing Skull remain silent only made her more curious. Holding the knife, he hesitated, then voiced disappointment at Frey for only now asking him that question. Seeing Harrier busy fetching water across the river, Free burst out laughing and repeated the reason to Skull. Skull slowly said he learned of her from a story told by an old friend. Holding the ham in his hand, he said that suspicion led him to come here himself to verify. Skull had gone directly to the battlefield the friend mentioned, to probe the truth. Each hot breath appeared clearly in the frigid air of the war-torn area. On that desolate, ice-choked road, Skull suddenly remembered his pitchable mother, wiped out so his family could become the strongest. Skull walked on and stopped before a strange sword plunged deep into a man's corpse. The corpse, pierced by the sword, gasped and spat contempt at Skull. The man's eyes filled with resentment toward him as he drew his last breath. Step by step he approached the place where the young man had fallen. He sat silently beside that cold corpse. He listened in silence to the belated complaints of the unfortunate youth. Lying on the freezing ground, cold and still, the young man still could not understand why his disciple's death had corrupted Skull so completely. He desperately wanted a reason to keep living. Blood spread red on the white snow as the young man thought perhaps Skull also wished to die a true hero's death. Skull grew annoyed hearing that man nag on and on. He looked into the distance and firmly declared that his disciple's death was entirely justified. Staring toward the horizon, Skull spoke softly but with a menacing undertone to the man. Skull deliberately let the man keep babbling so he could never abandon the past and move on. Skull decisively declared it was time for the man to repay the blood debt inflicted on his disciple. The man burst into a mocking, provocative laugh. He laughed with relish and dragged the disciple's name out to taunt Skull. He even sarcastically praised Skull's northern disciple. Skull turned his head to the mouth spewing those vile provocations. Remembering Harrier's wild, vital look, the man laughed with excitement. Skull's hands suddenly grabbed the man's hair at the nape roughly. Even lying on the cold ground, the man's mouth would not stop babbling, inciting words. He seized the man's throat, lifted him, tearing his body in two. The man could only look at Skull with hatred in his final moments. On the frozen battlefield, Skull suddenly felt remorse for letting the man live until now. But from this moment he would log out for harming his master's disciple. Skull squeezed the throat, but was not ready to let him go easily. He glared in fury and wanted the man to utter parting words before vanishing completely. Back in the present, Frey grew serious hearing Skull's tale, realizing all her secrets had been exposed. Skull gently prepared the rabbit and told her that all her questions had been thoroughly explained by the story. Frey's eyes showed suspicion about the story's authenticity. Placing the rabbit on the board, Skull grew curious at her ambiguous, loaded response. Skull remained nonchalant at her doubt, unaware of how the man had screamed in agony then. The cold blade sliced lightly into the fresh meat. The action matched each drop of blood spurting onto the cold snow. The meat was quickly divided by Skull's hand into evenly sized pieces. Frey tucked her head into her high turtleneck, as if to hide from the grim atmosphere. Skull stood and dropped the chunks into a pot of water about to boil. The young man's body in the past immediately became a true corpse. The bubbling of the soup blended with Frey's eerie laughter. Hearing her laugh, Skull was slightly surprised and looked back. Seeing Harrier returning, she uttered a pointed compliment to him. Frey looked at Skull provocatively and murmured arrogant taunts. Though eyeless, Skull skillfully signaled his acceptance of her challenge. Just as the stew reached a boil, the pact between them officially took effect. As Harrier returned with water, he saw a shooting star cross the sky. Unaware the gears of fate were shifting, soon the sky brightened, signaling the start of a new day. Skull led the way and signaled to the group that they had arrived at their destination. Before a massive fortress, he began assigning clear mission objectives to his two companions. A sudden call from behind made the two of them turn their heads. Frey, now in new clothes, still complained uncomfortably that she wanted a different outfit for easier movement. Skull handed her a mask to conceal her identity. After placing the mask on her face, Skull looked at Frey threateningly, ordering that once they obtained the supplies they must leave the village immediately. Seeing him disguised, Harrier suggested sneaking in, but Skull flatly refused. He even gave a thumbs up to show his confidence. But within minutes Skull found spears pointed at him from the guards on all sides. Seeing the troops surround them in overwhelming numbers, the three obediently raised their hands to surrender and wait for another chance. A dog bared its eyes and barked ferociously as an ill omen. The soldiers leveled their spears at Skull's group, whispering about the strong smell of the undead and insisting on a thorough investigation. He had just arrived and was already dazed by the siege. Then a guard volunteered to take over the group. His comrades, pleased at the thought of rest, agreed eagerly. Guardman Jill turned back and called for them to follow him. He walked ahead, recounting the ghost stories of the Blue Tower village as Skull's group followed. Rubbing the back of his head, Man Jill said that when he was an explorer he still kept up with news from old comrades. He removed his hat, his eyes sad as he told of the undead rising against the Empire. Man Jill knew explorers came to Rivet for the blacksmith's renown, and seeing them reminded him of his younger self. so he tried to help as much as he could. Skull was deeply moved and offered a sincere hand in thanks. Then, checking his watch, Mangil politely said he had military duties and reminded them to meet again at sundown. He accepted the offer without issue, even feeling this soldier was like a benefactor to him. So when everything was settled, Mangil replied casually that whatever was fine. Every young man who wants to grow up starts his journey with dreams, youth, ambitions to slay dragons and a dozen other things. But for a middle-aged person who has tasted life, that's hard. Compared to eager youth, they feel far behind when they face reality. Until now it was only the song, but the commentary made clear how sorrowful the melody was. He sat there bitterly realizing the song seemed to be about himself. It was about duties to protect family and homeland. Things that replaced taking up arms to hunt dragons with dreams of becoming a great explorer. But foolish youths grow up and find reality is different. They become lowly guards and develop the habit of listening to this song to nurse their sorrows. That music is for old warriors who have faced defeat and neglect. Their pride eroded over time, yet the music heals them somewhat. Hearing that, Skull thought and emphasized that what matters is to keep moving forward. Because when reality and ideals are weighed, what's left is an ego wanting to give up. He quickly advised the other to pursue their dreams and fear no obstacle, since only oneself can reach and fulfill one's ambitions. Just keep trying and you'll arrive like everyone else. But to Mangil the encouragement sounded easy, like something a seasoned man prepared to say. So without hesitation, Skull stood and lightly patted his shoulder to affirm his belief, a gesture that surprised him. Leaving the other to finish his duty, Skull departed, saying he'd wait at the place he'd mentioned and trying to pry open information about a shortcut. Quickly, he waved and left, pleased at the thought of soon eating on Mangil's coin. Watching them go, he could only watch and mutter that they were a strange bunch. Then the sky gradually shifted toward evening. At that time he was the only one left sitting in the empty square. Having waited too long, he braced himself and decided to head home. At that moment a shadow suddenly appeared, and asked why he was staying so long after the performance. Mangil heard the voice and turned, his face flushing red as he answered the question. It was the singer herself. She smiled, bared her teeth, raised a hand in permission, and asked if he could escort her home. Beneath the crimson sky, he thought how his colleagues would surely be envious. The singer smiled and asked what was so special about going with her, prompting Mangil to insist she's very hot in everyone's eyes. Her laughter followed, but the joy faded quickly at his rather pathetic comparison. After a while, Mangil wondered why she chose him among the crowd of fans. Was it chance? After thinking, she replied that others hear her song as sorrowful, but in his eyes she saw hope, like a valiant warrior. Besides, going with someone with clear, pure eyes made an impression on her. Hearing that, Mangil could hardly believe his ears. In his dazed state he almost admitted his feelings. Then, startled by what he'd heard, he felt unsettled about something. His awkward reaction made the singer press her lips and teasingly call him a fool. She then looked up and scolded Mangil for realizing things too late, a handhold initiated by the singer herself. The suddenness left Mangil frozen like a statue. Seeing her take his hand, his only thought was that they were actually on a date. They walked up to a house painted entirely red. As promised, Skull was inside, his face showing clear surprise. Seeing them holding hands, Mangil shyly gave an awkward little laugh. They quickly sat at a table. He spread out the map to chart the next route. At that moment, the two of them stared tensely at each other while Skull stood with his arms folded, watching. Then he pointed down at the map. He raised his hand to his chin, pondering something. Outside, the hall erupted in celebration. The music blasted loudly. Everyone danced wildly in joy. Inside, Skull let out a soft sigh. Harrier at his side stepped closer to ask if he was all right. Hearing that, he opened his hand and said he was just recalling some happy memories. About to drink, he realized it involved the first disciple and said he'd met her before. Back then, Carrier was tasked with dealing with a fierce monster when she suddenly appeared to help. She was an outstanding warrior with radiant righteousness, always ready to help others, a true hero. After finishing the story, he set his tea down and exclaimed. He went on to describe feeling confused about what justice really was, and what evil and enemies looked like in hell. Those questions about the true nature of war haunted Harrier with 1,000 thoughts. Like the guard and the singer, sometimes simply being together felt wonderful. Looking at those with swords at their backs, he wondered how their lives might differ if they were born in peace. But Skull had to say the truth. To gain normalcy, wars must occur to eliminate a faction. However ironic, it was inevitable. Those celebrating out there must shed blood in this era to secure peace for future generations. And he longed to bear all the guilt to bring them blessings. That was his silent prayer each time before a battle. Not finished, Skull spread his fingers and moved on to the second point. Hearing this, Carrier asked about the first point. He simply answered failure, since even a lifetime of struggle only secures peace for a mere 100 years. Therefore Skull was determined to keep fighting to maintain that peace. And he would fight with hands stained by the world. He declared his respect for everyone, then vainly asked Harrier to praise him more. On that peaceful night faint tremors began 12 km from Rivet Village. About 3 giant monsters appeared. Not stopping there, a large cloudy eye opened wide in terror. A natural disaster and a wave of monsters struck, thousands of blue goblins roaring. Amid the calm, the promise to meet again between the two echoed, threading through every home in the small village. The singer gently wished Man Gil a pleasant workday, making the guard's heart flush with embarrassment. After those sweet moments, they reluctantly said goodbye. Man Gil stood motionless for a while, gazing affectionately as her figure faded away. Seeing this, Pampio seized the chance to tease him for standing there smiling to himself. Not stopping at teasing, he kept firing off endless trivial questions. Even while Man Gil was trying to work, Pampio's interruptions forced him to give curt answers to continue his duties. Suddenly, a freight wagon appeared in the distance, approaching and wanting to enter the village. Man Gil immediately dropped his joking expression and seriously checked the wagon's travel papers. After confirming everything was in order, the wagon was allowed through and slowly entered the village. At that moment Pampio asked about Man Gil's future plan. Perhaps deep down, he was worried about the fate and future of this small village. In these troubled times, he still longed for a simple, happy home. Responding to his friend's anxiety, Man Gil glanced at him and calmly offered reassurance. Honestly, he cared about nothing else. His mind only wanted to be with the singer. But then the soldier softly called Man Gil's name with a pale face. Before them rode a messenger fallen atop his horse, racing madly toward the village. The messenger's motionless silence as he entered the gate made everyone uneasy. This strange sight spread quickly, causing widespread panic among those nearby. At the Rivulet Adventurers Guild notice board, the atmosphere grew tenser than ever. People buzzed, discussing the contents of the notice taken from the unfortunate messenger's body. Man Gil stared at the notice and then carefully explained the situation to Skull. Continuing, Skull began to elaborate on the terrible wave of monsters he had heard about from Man Gil himself. Not grasping the full meaning of his words, Frey had to ask again, forcing Skull to patiently explain once more. However, Man Gil dismissed Skull's view, saying this wave of monsters was far larger than he expected and was becoming an extinction-level disaster. He recalled that in the past, adventurers and knights would always appear to deal with monster waves. But alas, that is now history, for there are no adventurers or imperial knights left. The opulent empire has built strong defenses and no longer cares about this remote countryside. Man Gil looked at Skull and bitterly said that now only a few adventurers take it upon themselves to defend their homeland from being crushed. Images of his village comrades giving their all to protect their ancestral land filled his mind. The air around Man Gil turned bone, chilling as he imagined the village disappearing and the guards and adventurers gone. Amid the oppressive silence, an adventurer with a panicked face suddenly burst into the hall. He shouted, urging everyone to ready their weapons and gather in the square to fight the incoming wave of monsters. Immediately everyone set aside fear, hurriedly dividing tasks to prepare for the life or death battle. Skull also hurriedly cut short the conversation between him and Man Gil. He immediately drew up a battle plan in his head to minimize the village's losses. Man Gil watched his back leave in silence, fully trusting Skull's tactic. But a distant conversation caught Man Gil's attention. Someone bitterly realized the decree the messenger brought was issued by the state and carried no reward. They began to worry that those who fight only for pay would soon flee, making casualties inevitable. Not letting pessimism spread, Man Gil stepped forward to cut them off and sternly urged everyone to focus on preparing their gear to fight. After the call to arms, Man Gil decisively raised his hand. He gripped his cloak tightly, burning with a steely resolve to defend the village to his last breath. Outside the walls, dust rose in a thick cloud blotting out the sky. A fierce monster roared, the sound shaking the heavens and earth. Spotting its target, it charged wildly toward where Man Gil stood in its sight. Unfazed, Man Gil thrust his sharp spear high, driving it decisively through the creature's shoulder. He nimbly used the spear as a pivot, vaulting over it to avoid the counterattack by inches. Man Gil's legs clamped the monster's neck like a vice. He ruthlessly jabbed at its eye to seize the advantage, then shouted orders for everyone to counterattack quickly. Gastatory now had 2 vials in hand and rushed forward to help. He threw the 2 chemical vials accurately at the monster's face while Man Gil dodged to avoid splatter. The monster's steel, like hide, vaporized in white smoke, making it scream in agony. Then a spear suddenly flew from nowhere, finishing the creature off. But the battle didn't end there. As each subsequent wave would be stronger and harder to face, Man Gil muttered curses in frustration at the dire situation. Because of the Empire's selfish lies, he now had to face these mountain-sized monsters alone. Suddenly Man Gil felt the ground beneath him tremble violently. A colossal foot, weighing tons, appeared right before him. The creature's eyes flashed deadly light, Unlike the ordinary monsters before, in an instant, the massive, majestic form of a dragon loomed out of the dust. Seeing the horror, many people panicked, screaming and scattering in flight. A desperate adventurer tried to hold back the village's defenders, but was met with harsh refusal. Manjil tensed, grinding his teeth as the weight of pressure pressed on his shoulders. He remained standing tall, quietly watching the crowd stampeding away from the battlefield. In his heart, the warm, gentle smile of the singer from before suddenly returned. The heavy helmet fell to the ground, revealing the soldier's determined face. The ferocious dragon before him slowly opened its wide jaws, preparing to strike the killing blow. Small and alone, Manjil faced the giant dragon with no intention of backing down. In the village, the remaining guards hurriedly directed everyone to evacuate to safety. The singer hurried to the guards, anxiously asking about Manjil, but no one had any news of him. Gastatori suddenly approached them and decided to explain the critical state he was in to the singer. The nearby soldier, hearing this, immediately ran toward the young man to demand the truth. Gastatori hesitated a moment, then painfully delivered the bad news about the battle. At the front line, Manjil, though losing a lot of blood, forced himself to keep fighting. He took a run up and leapt high into the air. The warrior hurled himself at the great dragon with the last of his strength. The spear coldly drove deep into the wing of the legendary creature. Manjil risked everything, planting his spear into the dragon's wing to hold himself aloft. The monster roared and slammed the ground to create a shockwave to dislodge him, but he narrowly avoided the attack. Red blood streamed from the wound, smearing his face. Yet Manjil remained resolute, wildly swinging his sword to strike the dragon's leg repeatedly. The dragon's tail suddenly rose high and whipped down like a lightning bolt. It struck so hard the ground cracked, but Manjil, with extraordinary agility, dodged. He turned toward the dragon, then leapt back to gain a safe distance. The battle reached its climax as Manjil began to condense the last of his mana. He focused all that refined power into his spear. A blue lightning bolt suddenly flashed in the murky air. Using the all-thunder strike, he charged with his spear wrapped in thunder through the dragon's body. After the earth-shaking blow, residual sparks of lightning still flickered around Manjil. A huge gaping hole now appeared in the giant dragon's neck. This killing blow ended the dragon, its massive body collapsing to the ground. Exhausted, Manjil stood there gasping to catch his breath. Once again the singer's radiant smile flashed in his mind. She was the only girl who had always believed in and encouraged his dreams. A mouthful of fresh blood spat out as his internal injuries were severe. Still, Manjil forced himself on with iron determination to never give up. He struggled to lift his head and looked toward the battlefield swarming with enemies. His whole body launched forward like a drawn arrow. His heavy steps slowly left the ground to gain momentum. A high jump sent him charging at the monsters with a suicidal will. His gaze was unusually resolute, with the single thought of protecting the village. The large goblin raised its massive fist at the small figure speeding toward. Its punch struck the ground so hard the earth cracked into fragments. Manjil steadied his grip and drove his spear straight into the aggressive goblin's eye. The sharp spear pierced through to the back of its head. Suddenly, Manjil halted, sensing a surge of murderous intent approaching. A small goblin had been lurking and struck him from behind without him noticing. It clung to him and flashed a smug grin, thinking it had won. But instantly, Manjil landed a thunderous punch that sent it flying. He spun around, channeling all his strength into his arm. The spear drove hard, piercing through the dying goblin's chest. Its massive body arched backward from the momentum. Finally, it died and collapsed into a pool of blood. Exhausted, Manjil planted his spear into the ground to brace his worn-out body. He lifted his head and looked up at the sky one last time. Then he slowly slumped down, from sheer exhaustion. Amid the battlefield dust, Manjil still knelt there like a god. He breathed rapidly, his breaths ragged in the silent air. As other monsters lunged at him, he barely reacted, forcing out final words as if his life's mission were complete. Suddenly, a shadowy yet powerful figure of a weapon appeared before him. Harrier stepped forward, executing a bold northern combat style. Next came Free, who used the memory recover skill to support the team. Finally, Skull wielded a weapon and flawlessly performed the northern harvest technique. The three unleashed their skills in unison, sweeping through the monsters who vanished in an instant. After their cool rescue entrance, they reverted to bickering like usual. Frey softly called Manjil's name to check on him. She praised him without reserve for holding out so bravely until now. Manjil no longer recognized the people before him and could only stammer hopelessly. Skull stood proudly on a monster carcass and praised Manjil's resilience. He also reported the village's stabilized condition and continued to laud him, which finally brought a satisfied smile to Manjil. Then the three Skull, Frey, and Harrier seriously prepared to continue fighting the remaining monsters. The area near the village's southwest wall, once peaceful, now looked like a ruined wasteland under war's destruction. Amid that devastation, Manjil sat quietly to rest, watching the new comrades fight with focus. Skull, with a serious demeanor, led a charge into the encirclement, Frey close behind with a wild, excited smile. Under their sharp blades, the ferocious monsters were easily cleaved in two. To Manjil, they now looked weak and shattered like autumn leaves torn by a gale. He watched their artful, powerful fighting with profound admiration and reverence. Suddenly, a deep voice spoke right beside Manjil, startling him to attention. Harrier calmly wrapped a rope around his sword hilt as he explained further what he'd said. Before them the monsters surged like a tide. Yet Harrier remained composed as he explained the difference between meaningless sacrifice and dying to protect what matters. Having spoken, he drew the sword back behind him to gather momentum in a perfectly steady stance. Harrier gathered power in his arm and hurled the sword forward like a wind, splitting arrow. The blade flew in a perfect arc and struck the intended target exactly. A small sword was lodged deep in the giant dragon's neck, tethered to the sturdy rope in the youth's hand. Harrier braced himself, winding the rope around his arm, and left Manjil an enigmatic piece of advice. Manjil listened intently to his counsel, though his mind swelled with unanswered questions. Harrier offered no further explanation, and suddenly sprang forward with a powerful leap toward the enemy. When he reached the dragon, he yanked the sword from its neck, eliciting a booming, pained roar from the beast. Harrier's eyes flared, filled with unprecedented focus. In that moment, he recalled how the hero Muzan once majestically slew monsters. He unleashed the famed falling blossom technique, delivering a crushing slash straight into the dragon. After the strike, he brushed the dust from his face and sighed in weary relief. The dragon collapsed completely to Harrier's blow, yet he felt dissatisfied, believing he had not reached Muzan's level. Elsewhere on the battlefield, goblins kept charging like moths to flame. They focused their attacks on Harrier, who stood proudly beside the slain dragon. Suddenly Frey appeared, her eerie laugh echoing through the air. She dove from above right in front of Harrier, catching him off guard. In an instant, one unfortunate goblin had half its face sliced away by her. One by one the doomed goblins were crazily cut down by Frey in an uncontrollable bloodlust. Witnessing her frenzy, Harrier warned her anxiously to be more careful, but Frey shrugged off his caution, utterly confident in her superior combat skills. However, while she was busy boasting of her titles, a huge mouth suddenly appeared right behind her. The giant dragon attacked, biting Frey so hard that her leg was instantly severed. The dragon then casually swallowed Frey whole and lifted its head arrogantly like a victor. Suddenly a strange, brilliant light flared from within the mythical creature's body. Frey used a secret technique to burst out of the dragon's belly and escape spectacularly. Dragon blood sprayed everywhere, falling to the ground like a horrific crimson rain. From afar through the blood mist, Frey's silhouette began to emerge, hauntingly. Though now down to one leg, she stood firm with iron will. Frey appeared as if drenched in blood, her eyes blazing with murderous intent at the enemies. The two nearby monsters froze, staring at her in utter terror. With a lightning-fast stroke, she severed the arm of the nearest goblin. Harrier stood dumbfounded at the woman's madness and fierce vitality. He suddenly recalled everyone's fierce objections when the proposal to hire Frey as a mercenary was first raised. Back in the brutal present, Frey cheerfully held up her severed leg like a toy. She casually reattached it with magic, only lamenting the ruined expensive clothes she wore. Frey stood and leisurely straightened her outfit until it looked neat. Suddenly, she froze as if sensing something in the surrounding. On the other side, Harrier remained lost in thoughts about Frey's terrifying recovery and combat abilities. Frey paid him no mind and focused on moving, twisting to stretch her joints after the fight. Then she turned, licking the blood on her face as she asked Harrier how the fight felt. She began giving serious critiques of his moves, but Harrier bluntly refused to listen. So they started bickering and arguing like children again. Right before Manjil, his saviors began fighting each other, leaving him utterly baffled. Suddenly, a distant voice calling Manjil's name drew near. He was stunned to see the beautiful singer rushing toward him in a panic. Immediately worried, he hurriedly asked about the village and sighed with relief at the good news. The singer carefully recounted what had happened in the village during the chaos. After the story, she quickly turned to check his wounds, her face full of concern. Manjil smiled warmly and gently reassured his beloved. He took her small hands and excitedly recounted the glorious feats he had just achieved. But the singer, worried for his life, scolded him lovingly. Manjil gently placed a finger on her lips to stop the reproach she was about to speak. He expressed that her safety was thus the thing he worried about most in the world. He tenderly wiped the tear from her face and sincerely confessed how deeply he had missed her. He smiled brightly, a radiant smile like the sun after a storm. Manjil recalled the moment the singer voiced her genuine worry for him. He remembered her sobbing, terrified that something bad would happen to him. The singer happily took Manjil's hand as he wiped her tears and beamed. Because of her, he had given his all to fulfill his dream of protecting the village from the savage monsters. Manjil happily opened his arms and hugged her tightly as if to bind them forever. He recalled Pampio's wish for a happy family and believed he had found the key to that door. Their cloaks and explorer insignias fluttered in the wind like symbols of hope. Skull, with two sharp swords in hand, plunged down from above into the ranks of monsters. He decisively used his famed Northern Harvest technique. A powerful strike hammered straight down into the raucous monsters below. The monsters all screamed pitifully as they were struck suddenly. An unlucky goblin had the sword driven through its snout before it could cry out. Its limbs were blasted apart by the force of the blow, scattering everywhere. A fierce surge of magic flared from Skull's sword over the poor goblin's corpse. The goblin slowly dissolved into dust, exactly as Skull had calculated. He nostalgically recalled being a member of the glorious hero team and helping to defeat the Demon King. Skull quickly snapped out of the memory and shot off like a bolt of lightning. He loudly ordered Harrier and Frey to coordinate quickly to herd the monsters into one spot. Frey immediately rushed off, urging Harrier to wake up and complete the mission. The two began to work together with surprisingly smooth and harmonious coordination. They formed a magical circle that trapped all the monsters inside with no escape. The monsters looked around dazed, completely passive before the human encirclement. Skull saw the golden opportunity and accelerated even faster. He headed straight for the giant dragon leading the monsters ahead. Once more, he used his strongest technique to decide the battle. He performed a spectacular springing jump, then streaked forward like a shooting star. His target was the massive legs of the towering dragon. Upon reaching its belly, he suddenly halted to gather his strength. The wood-cleaving slash skill was unleashed. It severed the dragon's forelegs in a single strike. The great dragon screamed in pain as its massive body collapsed without support. However, Skull still felt unsatisfied that he hadn't finished it with one stroke. But a surprise came as Free also rushed in to assist. She appeared to provide timely support to Skull at the decisive moment, with a skillful coordinated move. She used her soul as a pivot for Skull to spring back toward the dragon, and in an instant, with combined strength, they cleaved off the dragon's remaining parts completely. It drew its last breath and died on the spot, ending the threat to the village. This valiant struggle officially became a heroic milestone in Rivulet Village's history. It was the first time the village faced disaster yet suffered minimal casualties. This miraculous result was achieved thanks to the timely arrival and support of outsiders from the city. After finishing all the cleanup in the village, Skull quickly took the map from the village chief, brushed his hands off decisively, and prepared to leave to continue his journey. Manjil felt a bit let down hearing that, but sincerely wished them a smooth journey. He knew well that without those three, his village would not have seen today. He vowed to use his own hands to rebuild Rivulet from the ruins, and he pledged with Skull to uphold their promise, ready to fight alongside him whenever called. When the fateful hour comes, the entire village together with Manjil will give their all to aid them. Hearing those heartfelt words, Skull felt somewhat reassured and turned his back to leave. Watching their backs fade toward the horizon, Manjil clutched the insignia in his hands like a treasure. He silently swore on a warrior's honor to become a great commander and protect the village to the end. Skull walked on, carrying many restless thoughts about the times, even as time stretched endlessly. He realized there were still people in the world who shone brilliantly and brimmed with hope. At the same time, far away in another place, something strange was happening. A girl with mysterious purple hair seemed to sense something extremely unusual approaching. For some reason, her eyelid kept twitching repeatedly, as if signaling a new storm was about to begin. In the distant countryside lay a street that gathered the continent's finest blacksmiths. These places billowed smoke, birthplace of nearly every masterpiece, a street where the flame of passion never dies, the blacksmith quarter. It was regarded as a commercial district trading the highest quality weapons and equipment. Heavy hammer blows fell on glowing steel, where the sound of hammering never ceased. The old city under the blue sky was called the City of Fire and Steel. Amid the bustling streets, Surtur's forge stood quietly as a distinctive landmark. Inside someone's side, Surtur looked at the pile of weapons he had forged with a touch of sentiment. After thinking, he called Doran over. The young man immediately stopped and answered his master. Still holding a weapon, Surtur asked how long he'd been apprenticing. He quietly replied a little over 7 years. Hearing this, Surtur praised that his apprentice had learned quite fast. Taken aback by the praise, Doran shyly rubbed his head and thanked him, modestly saying he merely copied his master's work. But Surtur interrupted to confirm he truly met the standards. The announcement left him stunned for a moment. Then Surtur declared that from now on he could engrave his own mark on weapons. A moment later Doran collected himself to ask if he really had passed and whether the master might change his mind. Surtur immediately confirmed and told him to wipe that dazed look off, and to buy a new hammer in the Smith Street tomorrow, while giving the old apprentice hammer to his successor. Doran celebrated excitedly and saluted, while Surtur turned away and teasingly called him a lunatic. This weapon called a hammer held a far deeper meaning for a smith than its appearance suggested. They seemed to have steel bodies, for the Iron Kingdom exceeded human endurance. It was their hands and feet that tamed the world of forged steel. The blows proved why every artisan considered the hammer given on graduation an inseparable soulmate to carry to the end of life. He bought his first hammer as soon as he officially entered the trade, a sacred right. Thinking that, Doran happily left, while Surtur sighed watching the symbol of a new chapter in life. He helplessly said he hoped the lad wouldn't get so excited as to buy useless trinkets. As Surtur turned, he heard strangers muttering about his ancient skeleton and threatening to rough each other up. Outside, the three spoke loudly to confirm the address, since one claimed his friend's brain had gone soft or memory failed after hundreds of years. The smith then asked what the commotion at his shop door was about. Skull immediately said they'd come at the right time, and asked if this was Surtur's forge. He promptly invited them in, thinking the guests were looking for his shop. Once inside, Surtur enthusiastically showed a range of gear from longswords, dual blades, and maces to armor and shields, insisting the forge excelled not only at weapons but also standard armor. As Harrier looked around, he explained the place is usually noisy with apprentices, but they were all out now so it's quite quiet. Then he turned back to ask what the customer actually needed. Skull pulled out the item, and bluntly said he wanted this repaired. He coldly asked if the smith could fix it. Cut to outside, the bustling street is the blacksmith quarter, the trade district. Doran felt a bit annoyed because the place was always crowded. Ads drew him in, tutting lines to buy masterpiece items. Another smith eagerly offered him a completion hammer at half price for his graduation. Seeing that, Doran hesitated. He recalled his master's warning, don't buy hammers with ornate engravings, as rust harms your work. Choose a wooden handle that's not slippery for easier repair, and most importantly the balance must be centered to avoid ruining your wrist. More he thought, the more Doran worried and told himself life would be cruel to fools, who only know forging. Seeing the swindler's goods had every flaw: gaudy engravings, slippery grip, poor balance. He ran off, calling the old smith a fraud and cursing his scrap to burn, leaving the man baffled and shouting. Weaving through the crowd, Doran thought he almost wasted money thanks to his master's advice. He'd wandered all day believing there must be a hammer for him. He resolved to keep running to find his destiny. Though the sky had begun to darken, Doran grew tired from failing to find one. As he despaired and complained, a passerby snapped at him to move so they could close up and go home. Doran clutched his head, worried that work starts tomorrow and he still had no hammer. He ran and cried, asking where his destiny was. Then Doran ran past an old man sitting silently. He felt something and turned back to look. Doran immediately analyzed the hammer as simply designed, with a sturdy wooden handle and perfectly balanced center. Looking closer, he was impressed its quality matched a master smith's or better. Doran asked to buy it. The old man replied of course it's for sale and asked if he liked it. He wondered why a talented smith would sell on the curb. The old man just smiled and said he flattered him. He bluntly said if he liked it he could take it, because he didn't need the money. Doran refused, not wanting to be a beggar, which startled the old man who teased him about his appearance. Then the man proposed he hear his story. If after listening he still wanted it free, fine, otherwise he'd charge. Doran asked if it was cursed. The old man laughed and confirmed it was indeed cursed. The tale began 40 years earlier when he first came to the Smith Street. He had been a promising novice, trained at many forges and improving daily. Then one day he received an offer from the nobility to be a private smith, tasked only with making flashy display arms. Moreover, the blacksmith quarter has 3 iron rules: never bow to nobility, never turn your back on those seeking apprenticeship, and a smith's departure must follow proper custom. But he was blinded by money and broke the rules. From then on, he lost the status of a true blacksmith. After that, he spent his life making useless decorations until one day he realized too much time had passed. That hammer fell. He regretted wasting his life. The man standing there was now a dying old man, no longer a steel smith. He had no apprentices, no forge, only hollow pride among displayed weapons, and the blacksmith in him had long been dead. Suddenly he resolved to pour his life into this final weapon. As a sinner who could teach no one, he hammered iron with regret, hoping someone would notice this hammer. Moved, he said that today's choice already satisfied. He added that he made it wishing his end would be someone's beginning. So please accept it. He smiled and said if a young man like you took it, it would be his greatest honor. After hearing that, Doran thought for a moment. Across the room, Surtur was troubled by a difficult customer's request. A call startled him. It was Doran. He came back to boast that the supreme hammer would be his start. Surtur wanted to see and told him not to talk nonsense. As soon as he held it, Doran hurriedly asked how the master found it. Surtur asked where he bought it, and he told the story of the old man at the end of the trade road. He looked at the hammer and thought the man still remembered how to make this. Then Surtur handed the hammer back and officially declared Doran a blacksmith. His works would bear his name. He also warned that though he would still work in the shop for now, he was an official smith, no longer a child. From the closed sign, Surtur moved to flip the board. His hand slowly turned back. Then Surtur struck down hard and called Doran's name. He banged on the door to warmly welcome him to the Smith Street. The skull-faced figure asked sadly whether the sacred sword could still be saved. Surtur helplessly explained this was a divine weapon forged from holy bones, a class far beyond his craft. Hearing this, the skull nostalgically remembered when this place once forged a demon blade from the horn of its eternal enemy. Surtur was astonished, insisting he had never met this customer nor recalled making such an extraordinary item. The skull smiled and replied that the smith he knew had actually died centuries ago. Staring at the mysterious being, Surtur suddenly realized this customer was not of human blood. Without hiding it, the skull admitted that truth but stressed his origins no longer mattered. Without probing further, Surtur recounted the legend of the founder Smith who left a cryptic message for future generations. That message told descendants to treat the ageless thief well, the great benefactor of Surtur's forebears. He suddenly realized the legendary figure in the tale seemed to be standing before him. Though deeply moved, Surtur had to refuse because the item was beyond his reach. But he hinted a banished smith who broke taboos might help. Frey beside him mocked in disappointment about the wasted trip after failing to get the expected result. Surtur gently advised that amid this craftsman's quarter full of scams, there are still genuine forges quietly devoted to their craft. He believed the customer's sincerity had reached the forebears, breaking the usual strict validation rules. Surtur directed them to cellar No. 74, the retreat of a master smith versed in yin energy and cursed artifacts. It was called the forge where gods once called, a name steeped in mystery. Before long, their group arrived at the shop and curiously stepped into the mysterious interior. The room was filled with bizarre weapons of grotesque shapes never seen anywhere else. Frey laughed with delight at the eccentric relic collection of the anonymous owner. Harrier anxiously checked on his master, while the skull-faced man pinched his nose, complaining about the smoke smelling like someone had overeaten sweet potatoes. Suddenly, from the deep dark cellar, a haunting voice rose to address the uninvited guests. The mysterious figure apologized, saying he had been occupied with a prayer ritual that had just ended. He invited them to set down their luggage and move deeper inside to share a drink. Following the invitation, the group cautiously ventured into the darkness of the long tunnel. But even after walking steadily for 2 minutes, they still couldn't find the end of this maze. Frey grew impatient and demanded an explanation about the odd layout and the host's reception. Immediately, the cold skull declared they had stepped into a prearranged trap. He had sensed the dark magical current quietly enclosing the group from their first steps. Knowing this, he still advanced, feeling insulted by the blatant, disrespectful greeting of the hidden one. The eerie voice rang out again, asserting he would never be warm to non-human entities. He clearly declared there would be no smiles for those who do not belong to the human world. Suddenly, a hand reached from the darkness and touched the skull as someone shouted, "Purify." With authority, a blazing red flame erupted, engulfing the skull's body. The attacker screamed with fury, vowing to banish this wandering spirit back to the cycle of death. Seeing his master in danger, Harrier did not hesitate and lunged straight at the assailant. However, he was quickly stopped by magically charged divine chains. Thus Frey and Harrier were put on the defensive, forced to withstand a barrage of attacks. Both struggled to fend off the chains that longed like venomous serpents. In the chaos, Harrier's dagger was easily snatched by the enemy. Immediately after, the invisible chains tightened around the young man's entire body. By contrast, Frey remained nonchalant, even intrigued by the man's prowess. Amid the raging flames, the skull suddenly spoke, urging everyone to keep calm. He laughed heartily, and remarked that the temperature of this purifying fire was actually quite pleasant. This left the attacker utterly stunned to see a high-level purification entirely ineffective. Instantly, the skull unleashed a terrifying power that extinguished the red flames in an instant. He casually brushed dust from his shoulder and savored the sensation of power unleashed after so many days of restraint. The skull-faced guest insisted that though he was a spirit, he harbored no malicious intent as his opponent assumed. He was willing to take a blow if the other wanted, but he valued talking to find common ground. That attitude made the mysterious man laugh at the irony of the situation. He admitted that a death-faced spirit who spoke so reasonably was indeed a rare guest. The man felt exhilarated after witnessing such an unexpectedly dramatic scene. He introduced himself as Theo, a monk and master smith here, then invited everyone to sit and talk. Once settled, Theo confirmed the request to restore the severely damaged divine weapon presented by the skull. He was curious about the origin of the demon sword that had been split in two and lost its spirit. The skull explained that missing the other half, the sword could no longer sustain the forms of the spirits it created. Theo judged that a spirit possessing a divine weapon forged from a god's body, an intelligence like his had truly strayed from natural law. Unwilling to waste words on his background, the skull focused on whether Theo had the skill to repair this treasure. Theo interrupted, asserting his rule. He must understand the story behind each piece of equipment before working. He only truly takes up the hammer when he feels the owner's reason can move his heart. All glory and suffering must be voiced here at this sacred forge. He cannot forge weapons or armor without knowing the true purpose they will serve. Without the soul of the story, even the sharpest divine arms are just lifeless lumps of metal. With that, Theo snapped his fingers. A great flame blazed up. He sat and patiently waited for the special guest to begin recounting his journey. For the greater cause, the skull poured out his heart about his tumultuous, storm-ridden life. He spoke of his close comrades, and the journey of caring for a little blonde girl. A pain that pierced to the core surfaced when he had to watch that little girl draw her last breath before his eyes. He held that form in despair and an unending sorrow to the bone. From that hatred, the skull gathered new allies to begin a blood-soaked revenge. On that arduous path, many of his close companions fell forever. Hearing this, Theo was stunned and exclaimed at such a cruel fate, likening the escaped hero's tale to the grandest epics. Even Free was surprised to hear the tragic past and hidden depths the skull had long concealed. Theo pressed his hands together respectfully, saying no further reason was needed to empathize with the story. However, the smith still noticed key suspicious points in the guest's account. Images rising from the flame of truth gradually pieced together a panoramic picture of the reality. The fire proved that all the skull's words were naked truths issued from the depths of his heart. Theo awoke to the truth and affirmed that his initial suspicions were entirely correct. He asked whether the skull always believed that all his necrotic power came from the demon sword. The skull confirmed it, saying of course the sword had been forged from the demon king's horn, so that belief was natural. Theo countered, arguing it was actually a misconception born from the skull's own mindset. He had clung to the idea that that evil power belonged to the sword, not to his own being. Hearing this, Harrier could only stare blankly, unable to grasp the deep philosophy Theo spoke of. Theo continued to explain to his guest the true nature of magic, which is highly abstract. He asserted that magic arises from people's deepest thoughts and strongest desires. Just as the warmth of fire saves one near freezing, fervent belief is the source of all spells. Mages trust in themselves and monks in the divine. All borrow power from core belief. The skull cannot manifest power, because he has bound his mind to the notion that the sword is the master of the magic. This left the skull bewildered, thinking everything happened due to his own misguided faith. Theo insisted firmly that the demon sword had never bestowed any necrotic power upon him. It was the skull's own inner self that awakened the Legion of the Dead and caused the destruction. In a blunt tone, Theo declared that the skull was in fact the true demon king. Meanwhile, in a distant place, nobles were abuzz over the complete annihilation of a battalion. They worried whether the emperor already knew of this humiliating defeat and was trying to cover it up. The cowardly nobles wanted to handle everything in the shadows to preserve their personal honor. One of them angrily argued this was a disaster that couldn't be hidden and would surely be exposed. He couldn't believe thousands of elite troops could vanish completely in the blink of an eye. He criticized the use of Frey as a deadly mistake, since no one could control that madhound. He proposed arresting Frey immediately and punishing him with the harshest penalties as an example. The nobles agreed in unison to demonstrate the empire's absolute authority against rebels. They sought to instill utter terror into the minds of anyone daring to oppose the power. A deadly message of despair was being prepared to send to all the empire's enemies. At the same time, the image of a girl watching a withering flower appeared as a secret, potent card the empire was about to play. Cut to the next morning at Surtur's forge. Doran, stunned by the skull's tale, asked incredulously whether Uncle Theo had really agreed to forge a weapon for them. The skull nodded slightly, saying that though it began awkwardly, after talking he had agreed. Doran was overwhelmed, surprised that such a master would accept. Truly, one sees everything with age. Seeing Doran overact, the skull grew curious and asked if it was so surprising that an eccentric like him got the job. Doran asserted firmly that if you picked the city's most unique person, he'd be top 5, and in skill he'd rank first. Ordinary craftsmen like him only mass-produced goods. Artisans like that were different. If not truly necessary, they would never swing the hammer. Most traditional technicians are oddballs, but their talent matches it, and Theo is the strangest among them. Such people will refuse any payment if displeased, especially Theo, whose last commission was 2 years ago. Hearing this, the skull couldn't hide a hint of pride, seeing it as a great honor. But Doran thought differently. He felt honored that a smith agreed to receive them. Truly a strange matter. However, the skull rejected that idea, saying many adventurers disdain artisans. Those who speak so are fools who should relearn basics before touching a sword. Only after long struggle on the battlefield does one understand that smiths and adventurers are inseparable comrades. If a weapon can't endure its wielder's power, an adventurer will never dare fight at full strength. Behind every warrior stands the silent figure of the smith. Because of that, he affirmed his strong trust in this street and in you all. Surtur fell silent for a moment, then thanked him for the trust while reminding him that ultimately, the one you must trust most is yourself. When used to slash, it's a sword. When used to thrust, it's a spear. Though unsure what he'll use it for, he was certain the skull was not evil. So he advised him to be confident, since he must trust himself more than he thinks. Hearing this, the skull grew a bit pensive and murmured about understanding who he truly is. Then he awkwardly replied with thanks. Suddenly, Harrier on the other side slammed his palm down hard on the table. Then he shouted loudly for his master. He begged earnestly to spar with him after their long separation. Cut to later at the empty lot. The skull looked around, amazed at how vast the area behind the village was. At the same time, Harrier opposite was actively warming up and thanked him for accepting the sudden request. He cheerfully replied, holding his half-chopped wooden sword, that it was no problem, though a bit surprising. Frey, bored in a distant rock hollow, cried out that he should teach the brat with his heart, not words. She also told him to ponder her words, meaning carefully during the fight. Her words confused him, but he pretended to have grasped them. He recalled their last spar back in the northern range. Harrier across agreed, still feeling sore when remembering it. Then he warned Frey not to interfere, and she stuck out her tongue teasingly and told him not to worry. In truth, she thought fighting a skeleton in this mental state would be no fun. She then volunteered as referee and loudly called the start. Instantly, Harrier surged forward at extreme speed. Frey privately judged that his speed had improved greatly. She sensed his remarkable growth since they first met and felt thrilled. At this, Harrier's strikes became increasingly relentless and powerful. However, the skull chose a passive defensive approach. He responded with somewhat careless and unfocused blows. Yet that did not make him yield to the youth's vigor. He quickly used his blunted wooden sword to deflect Harrier's blade. Taking advantage of his still superior speed, he swiftly dropped the sword and pummeled the boy repeatedly with his bare hands. After dominating for a while, the skull pulled the sword stuck in the ground free. He lunged and threw a straight thrust at his opponent. It seemed as if everything had ended there, but unexpectedly, Harrier managed to trap the blade between his arms, into his biceps to stop the strike. He grabbed the hilt, swung the sword toward his neck, but fortunately the skull bent down to dodge. Then he swept his leg across the skull's ankle, causing him to nearly tumble. However, Harrier quickly regained the upper hand, and delivered a series of kicks to him. Seizing the moment while he struggled, he nimbly sprang back to create a safe distance. Now the two stood face to face, and within mere seconds, Harrier launched another relentless assault. This time the skull struck first. He quickly shattered Harrier's wooden sword, but his own blade was also broken by the boy's forearm. Weaponless, the skull was forced to fight with his bare hands. Then the two resumed their fierce brawl. Suddenly Harrier came up with a bold idea. He used his foot to fling up sand and dust, hurling it straight at the skull. While the skull's vision was blurred by the white sand, Harrier ran in to sweep his legs, but the skull leaped up to evade. Not stopping there, Harrier spun around. He launched a powerful punch aimed straight at him while he was still airborne, but the skull quickly grabbed his arm to use as leverage. He spun once in midair, then kicked hard in his rear, sending him flying toward the tunnel and kicking up a cloud of dust. Frey sat back whistling, watching and silently praising the counter that exploited the landing moment. The skull anxiously shouted, asking if he was badly hurt. Harrier quickly sprang to his feet after that crushing kick. He wiped the scratch from his face and remarked that, as he predicted, his master had grown much weaker. During the bout, he clearly moved only to defend. He wondered why the skull didn't exploit the blind spot to finish the match as before. Or was it because he saw him as too weak and held back? Hearing that, the skull despondently defended that Harrier was overthinking things, yet Harrier stubbornly asked if it was true. Even Frey chimed in, asserting that he had clearly been yielding to that brat. She said someone who'd faced him before would know he's weakening, or rather his psyche has softened. He bristled and threatened to deal with her first if she kept babbling, but Harrier agreed with that view and said she was completely right. He noticed that since leaving the forge yesterday, the skull seemed burdened with worries. He asked if the words back there had troubled him so much. The skull grew annoyed and asked if he challenged him just to talk about it. Harrier retorted that as fighters, they'd understand each other better by fighting than by sitting and drinking tea. He worried that the unstable mood would drag him back to the lost days when they first met at the Northern Guild. He believes that even when one loses their way, they can return to the right path as he once did. Harrier began losing control and shouted that his master was no longer alone. Even if people call him the Demon King, He will always be the master of him and Mira, a warrior of the north. For his dream, he left home to assist him on the path of righteousness. He asserted that he was not a taker of lives but a hero whose sword saves many. Those words left the skull silent in thought about this decaying world and its thick darkness. But because of that, he felt fortunate to have met bright stars as comrades. He laughed unconsciously and felt truly lucky. Then he quickly regained his spirit and challenged Harrier to another duel at full strength. He eagerly accepted the challenge. Frey, who had been dazed, blinked and stood up to watch them. Now the two fell into tense silence. They waited for the smallest signal to begin the second round. At that moment, a shard of rock suddenly fell from the large boulder across, though only a small impact. It was the fuse for the battle. As the fragment lightly hit the ground, both sides surged forward to join the fight at once. In this round, the skull no longer held back and fought Harrier wholeheartedly, driving both of their speeds skyrocketing. Frey grew excited as he realized the situation had completely reversed. He had fully switched to relentless, continuous attacks. Harrier had to focus on maximum defense, waiting for a decisive counter chance. The two clashed in an extremely fierce and tense duel. It seemed he was increasingly trapped, only able to defend, letting him pummel his defensive stance. At that moment, he suddenly changed direction and drove a powerful blow into his stomach. The strike forced him to cry out in pain. Quickly, he closed in and pressed him toward the large boulder. Harrier was forced to continue defending in a precarious situation, but he did not give up and edged along the cliff to move to the left. He endured the opponent's thunderous punches, even if he struck as if he had 6 arms and 6 legs. For him, it was a precious chance to grow. As soon as he recognized the next strike, Harrier widened his eyes and used keen judgment to wrap his arms around him and push him away, but he quickly braced his foot to hold his ground. He wondered why you used a feint to grapple, instead of delivering a finishing strike. Saying that, he sighed and prepared to elbow his back to end it. Then Harrier suddenly shouted with determination. He leapt with all his strength while still holding tight around his waist. He pulled his leg in and drove a powerful kick backward. The kick made the massive rock begin to crack into fragments. Huge boulders toppled down, threatening to crush the opponent. This stunned him as he realized you'd purposely lured him into the falling rock zone. The recent hug wasn't to throw him but to hold his feet in place. Instantly the giant rocks crashed down, creating a choking cloud of dust that obscured vision. Seizing the chance, Harrier launched a thunderous kick intending to smash the skull's face and win. Frey in the distance laughed, delighted by his creative use of the environment. She thought that even if he blocked the rocks, he couldn't dodge an ambush in the dust. But she also realized he'd picked the wrong opponent for this trick. Suddenly the skull thrust a fist straight at Harrier's jaw, freezing him. He knew he'd lost and hurriedly raised his hand in surrender. He admitted he was completely defeated by his master. Hearing that, the skull withdrew and thanked him for a match that cleared his mind. He praised his strength and combat sense, saying they'd improved greatly. Harrier trembled with joy at the compliment and asked if he had helped him warm up. He affirmed that Harrier had truly grown much stronger since the Northern Guild. Blushing, Harrier stammered his thanks. At that, Frey stood up to warm up, eager for her turn. However, the skull looked bored and asked why it had to be her. She reminded him how sullen he'd been when he heard the name Demon King yesterday, which had left him speechless. She sneered perversely that no matter who he was, he'd still be ugly like that. This angered him, and he demanded to settle the score with her. He proposed a best-of-5 match to decide it all. Frey excitedly declared that on the battlefield only the last one standing matters, then charged forward. Harrier couldn't stop her and could only watch from afar. Suddenly 2 giant iron pillars fell from the sky, blocking between them. The incident forced them to pause the fight in astonishment. The skull didn't understand where those iron pillars had come from. At that moment, a purple-haired girl appeared, her face full of anger. She scolded them as lunatics for daring to wreck the village's mineral mine, then demanded they explain their actions immediately. Cut to, Harrier lay battered on the bed, causing the skull to worry and ask after him. He anxiously asked if Harrier was okay, and Harrier gently reassured him he was fine and told everyone not to worry. But Doran beside him began to grumble, complaining that even real combat training needs restraint. If this keeps up he'll age prematurely from worry. Hearing that, the skull hurriedly denied the horrible incident, explaining it was the green-haired girl who acted like a famed assassin, hurling an iron pillar at Harrier and causing this mess. Doran was left speechless, then urged everyone to be forgiving. Perhaps Magnia had snapped after receiving a report of strangers sabotaging the mine. Curious, the skull asked if she was someone they knew. Doran replied matter of factly that in this street no one didn't know her reputation. He said that on the Smith's street he mentioned, she was a once-in-a-century genius, though to him she was just the neighbor who sneaks over to steal coffee. Hearing everything, Magnia glared red-faced and asked if Doran felt bothered whenever she visited. Doran immediately played innocent to let it pass, Suddenly the room door swung open. Surtur entered and, surprised to see Magnia early, she giggled that she rushed over because an adorable junior was waiting for tutoring. Doran was completely oblivious until the smith's sister explained that their master had asked her to give him extra instruction after his apprenticeship. She said that beyond hammering, many artisans work here, and the best way to become a true smith is to gain experience in many forges. Eavesdropping, the skull was surprised that training a smith required so many resources. While Frey cheekily suggested stealing techniques, he was left speechless and warned her to mind the mood, you madwoman. Magnia replied that her research was nearly finished and she had time, then teasingly touched Doran and asked if he felt delighted. Doran scowled, saying it wasn't fun. He knew she'd send him to fetch coffee. Suddenly Doran remembered something and asked if the research she'd worked on for so long was only now complete. She proudly affirmed it was a labor of love masterpiece, the great wish of hers and a close friend. It was an invention that would provide defensive power for all imperial citizens in this era of chaos. Suddenly Surtur, annoyed, demanded Magnia abandon the research, but she stubbornly retorted that it was nearly finished. She glared at him and declared it was a promise between her and her friend, even if he were that friend's father. She couldn't betray their bond. The skull, sweating at the tense scene, thought to himself how heavy the atmosphere had become. Surtur sighed, removed his apron, and told Magnia to help with the forge work a bit before the tutoring began. He handed the apron to Magnia. She grinned and promised to help wholeheartedly provided he paid handsomely later. Seeing him give the apron to Magnia, Doran grew jealous and complained he'd never even borrowed the master's apron. Magnia teased him, would such a trivial thing make him jealous? Surtur sternly warned Doran that this street worships strength ruthlessly. Talent matters, while personality or background do not. He held up Magnia as an example, telling of a frail girl once left on the battlefield who had become a powerful master. Hands that should have been held by a father instead gripped an iron hammer. Arms that should have been cradled by a mother instead embraced the furnace's blazing heat. Her frail body caught up with a strong spirit, and the once scarred girl proved her extraordinary effort. He wanted Doran to learn the resilient spirit well of a true artisan. Cut to the mid-mountain area near Smith's Street. A hoarse-voiced Vokas sneered at the Empire's recruitment officer, the commander of the 3rd Legion. His face half scared, wondered why he had to come to this little blacksmith town. The other raised 2 fingers confidently. She smiled and explained their simple goal: fully occupy Smith's Street and exhume the smiths' graves to take their hammers. She said the smiths here use one hammer their whole lives, so their dedication becomes magic that inhabits the metal, turning the hammer into a powerful mana conduit. It seemed the locals didn't know this truth, and buried those treasures with the dead. From her perspective, that cemetery was an invaluable gold mine. Volka asked about the wanted spirit from Thingthapi village. Was it also there? He called her an old fox for caring only about antique hammers, not the common mission. She burst out laughing, and admitted she was simply someone who seized opportunities. She outlined a plan to occupy the town, dig up the graves, and deal with that spirit while they re-at it. Finally, she produced a glowing blue stone, claiming it was the most important thing. Volka stared. He realized it could turn the tide of war. She nodded excitedly, saying they must requisition it to the capital for immediate study. But Volka was uninterested. He crushed a fistful of sand and declared they'd suppress by force before the Death Knights arrived. He warned her the situation was urgent, and they must act cautiously. Rash action would ruin everything. She nodded and accepted the order, promising to be as careful as possible. As dusk fell, and then when night descended, they began to move. The recruitment woman started inquiring about infiltration status inside. A scout reported everything normal except the Thingthapi spirit had just caused trouble in the mine. She was surprised the spirit didn't bother hiding its identity, then ordered a full report later. The soldier added that the old imperial smith seemed to have returned to the town. Hearing that, she muttered curses about the troublesome old man. She felt there were more complications than expected. Then she reconsidered and thought this was an opportunity to accelerate the plan. Grab the goods and withdraw quickly before the Death Knights arrive and turn everything to ashes. A while later, they sneaked into Magnia's workshop through the window. She ordered her men to search every corner thoroughly, because the item had to be nearby. Then Magnia's voice suddenly rang out, reminding them the shop had been closed long ago. She demanded to know what they were searching for, and how they dared to pick the lock at such a late hour. She asserted the valuable items here weren't worth what scum like them could pay. Yet the female intruder calmly replied she was just an imperial official carrying out her duty. She brazenly declared all her enhanced weapons and new inventions would be seized for the imperial treasury for the common good, and reached toward the sword at her hip as a threat. Magnia burst into loud laughter, finding those words utterly ridiculous. Seeing Magnia laugh, the girl smiled too, but then ordered her accomplices to kill her. On that command, Two soldiers immediately lunged at Magnia, but she had anticipated it and stepped back swiftly. She beckoned, signaling her silent assistance. Instantly, several daggers sliced through the air. They pierced the armor and killed the soldiers on the spot. The intruder became highly alert as her men fell. She stared in horror as her subordinate was slaughtered by the smith, not even able to let out a cry of pain. Now she could only praise in fear the fascinating power of Magnia's enchanted items. Magnia laughed, her fingers moving gracefully, controlling the dozens of knives on the wall, to move at her will. She proudly explained she'd inlaid them with perfect aim effects, turning them into true flying blades. Though they were extremely expensive and single-use, they allowed a smith like her to kill a regular knight with ease. Now, answer, how did you open the door and what are you looking for? Not giving the intruder a chance to speak, Magnia declared sharply that money no longer mattered, because she had decided to charge a viewing fee for her unique wares. With their very heads on their shoulders,